Okay. The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's Members' Day hearing. Apparently, we are scheduled to have votes during this hearing, so I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, the request is agreed to. I would like to welcome everyone to the Budget Committee's Members' Day hearing. Members' Day is a long-standing tradition in the Budget Committee, Crafting the budget resolution is not an easy task, so I look forward to this annual hearing because it gives us the opportunity to hear the budget priorities of our colleagues. Good governing and responsible budgeting requires smart, often difficult choices. This process begins by evaluating the trade-offs our choices require. How much should we invest in our national and economic security? How much funding is needed to ensure our citizens do not go hungry or homeless? How much is needed to provide a safe and secure retirement? How do we pay for the services and programs the American people want and need? Perhaps the biggest issue facing us this year is the remaining years of the austerity level spending caps required by the Budget Control Act of 2011. We face $126 billion in cuts to defense and non-defense discretionary spending next year alone. This is neither sustainable nor responsible. We need to raise the caps for both defense and non-defense spending to ensure that every American family has the chance to build a better future. We've come together in a bipartisan manner in the past to provide necessary funding, and we can do it again. If we don't, investments that are vital to our economic and national security will face devastating cuts. In order to build a budget to serve our nation, our committee will get as much input as possible. We listen to our constituents, review the President's budget request, review views and estimates from authorizing committees, and hear from outside experts and advocates. At the end of this process, our goal is to construct a budget that sets priorities while remaining fiscally responsible. This hearing is a vital piece of that process. I'm pleased and honored to serve with my friend, Mr. Womack, distinguished ranking member from Arkansas, and I look forward to working with him as we move forward. I would also like to thank members for taking time out of their busy schedules and appearing before the committee today. With that, I'd like to yield to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Womack, for his opening remarks.
I thank the chairman. Very much appreciate his leadership and also the collegial way in which he conducts his business, and I am grateful for that. It's great to be here with him. I want to start by commending you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff for drawing 26 of our colleagues to participate in our Members' Day. That's 26 times more member participation we experienced at this very hearing last year when our friend, Mr. Kildee, was the only member to testify before the committee. Although I would note that at our Joint Select Committee hearing on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform, 25 testified, and that was good news. As we undergo the process of crafting a budget resolution for this fiscal year, I'm encouraged to see members from across the country with diverse perspectives and constituencies join this discussion. To all our colleagues, your voices are an important part of this conversation, and I thank you for being here today. As everyone in this room knows, the fiscal health of our nation is deteriorating, and unless we take significant action, this trend will soon begin to impact every aspect of American life, from the strength of our economy to the strength of our national security. According to the Congressional Budget Office, if we maintain the status quo, deficits will total $11.5 trillion, and the national debt will rise to nearly $34 trillion over the next decade. Over that same period, federal debt held by the public will surge from 78% to 93% of GDP, the highest debt levels since just after World War II, and more than twice the average level of the past 50 years. So what's driving our deficits? To me, it's simple: out of control, unchecked spending. As we heard from CBO Director Hall earlier this year, mandatory spending programs such as Medicare and Social Security are the core drivers of our deficit and debt. Today, mandatory spending accounts for 70% of total federal spending and is expected to increase to 78% of total federal spending by 2029. What does that really mean for workers and families? It means that programs they're paying into today and counting on for the future may not be around when they need them most. It also means there will be fewer dollars for basic government operations, including defense, homeland security, and education. These are the programs that are being squeezed by mandatory spending. Despite these very real fiscal threats over the last several months, we've been hearing more and more about proposals that will exacerbate our problems rather than solve them. To that end, I want to ask the other side again, what is the plan to reconcile the desire for astronomical spending increases with the need to address the ballooning national debt? Will you pass a budget? And if so, give us the timing. We have a moral obligation to get our fiscal house in order, to make sure that our children and grandchildren aren't saddled in the future with spending decisions Washington makes today. That requires tough choices. That requires asking ourselves, can we afford it? And should our constituents be forced to pay the price? I look forward to the hearing and the Q&A that will ensue following each member's presentation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for your leadership, and I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member. As a reminder, members appearing before the committee today will have 5 minutes to give their oral testimony, and their written statements will be made part of the formal hearing record. Additionally, as the ranking member referenced, members of the committee will be permitted to question witnesses following their statements, but out of consideration of our colleagues' time, I would ask that you please keep your comments brief. As we say, I think we actually now have 27 witnesses, so obviously this hearing could go on for days and days and days if we had full committee questioning by all the committee. So with that, it's an honor to recognize Mr. Case, Hawaii, for his testimony. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee. I'm Ed Case, representing Hawaii 1, the beautiful city of Honolulu. And as one member who served previously and including service on this committee, I very much appreciate your responsibilities and your hard work. I'm here today in support of a fiscally responsible budget for FY20, a budget that would focus our core functions and discretionary priorities within our means. It would require a whole budget, long-term approach with bipartisan solutions to one of the most challenging issues facing our country. Our national debt, as we all know, has now surpassed $22 trillion, a huge number. But what is most revealing to me is that although $22 trillion is a large number, what is more important to me is that when I left Congress in January 2007, it was $9 trillion. $9 trillion to $22 trillion in half a generation, an unprecedented amount. And as we all know, the interest on our debt is now the fastest growing part of our budget. Next year, we'll spend more money on interest payments on the debt than all federal funding. And by 2025, it may well exceed our defense budget. This not only represents great risk to economic, social, and defense stability, but is a stark indicator of fiscal unsustainability. Some say that budgets and deficits and debts don't matter, and we can and should spend more without also raising revenue. This feed the beast approach is the mirror image of the starve the beast approach that we've also seen. Both are wrong as a matter of fiscal, economic, budgetary, and social policy. We do need a budget that is not just an aspirational exercise, but instead a document that comprehensively addresses our nation's needs and expenses. As you both alluded to in your opening statements, we have urgent challenges from climate change to healthcare and beyond, and we need a full and difficult debate on how best to address them in a fiscally responsible way. You both also referenced the fact that if we continue on this currently fiscally unsustainable path, we will in fact reduce our ability to deal not only with normal course needs, but with future emergencies or recessions. This is borne out in a number of examples that we've discussed repeatedly over the years, but are becoming much more acute, including the draining of the Social Security Trust Fund, the Highway Trust Fund, placing greater pressure on our overall budget, and deferring these issues only compounds them. We need to return also to regular order. We need to pass both the budget and standalone appropriations legislation on time, every time. This lends both internal stability and external predictability to the process. As co-chair of the Blue Dog Caucus's Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform Task Force, I encourage this committee to set meaningful goals to reduce the budget and put a plan forward to achieve these actions on a bipartisan basis as and where we can. Because the longer we wait, the worse these options become. Let me talk briefly about a huge priority that I view out there right now, and that is the priorities of our challenges in the Indo-Pacific region, my own backyard. Hawaii is closer to Asia than it is to Washington, D.C., much of Asia, and we spend a lot of time dealing with the Indo-Pacific region, a region that has incredible economic contributions, economic promise, social promise and challenge, and an area where our interests are rooted deeply in the future, an area which will determine our country's future and our world's future, the Indo-Pacific region. It inherently plays a critical role in our foreign policy priorities, including combating climate change, countering violent extremism, and promoting democracy and the rule of law. And our investment and commitment on these issues in the region need to reflect the overall strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific, whether we are talking about defense or whether we are talking about soft power exercises, supporting our allies, supporting our partners, and really trying to enforce an international rules-based order. When we look in this area, we certainly need, I believe, to prioritize our response to China's growing role in the world. And this cuts across many, many different aspects. As you go through your budget process, then, I would ask you not only to try to work towards a fiscally responsible budget, and not only try to work towards a budget that is delivered on time, on budget, and that the Appropriations Committee and other agencies of Congress, as well as the private sector, can depend on, but also a budget that focuses on the priorities out there in the rest of our world, to include the Indo-Pacific region. I thank you very much for your time and appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts and stand ready, willing, and able to work with you on a bipartisan basis to solve our budget problems. Mahalo.
Mahalo to you. Thank you very much for your testimony. Do any members on the committee wish to ask questions of Mr. Case? Mr. Burchett's recognized.
You're from Hawaii?
Yes, I am.
Since I missed part of that, I was wondering maybe if we could take a Codell to Hawaii, maybe to check into this a little further, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think, we can certainly educate you on the budget from the perspective of the Indo-Pacific region, if you want to put it that way. I think that's a very worthwhile exercise by Congress. I invite you.
I'll rephrase my question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question of the witness? Thank you, Mr. Case. I now recognize Mr. Cole of Oklahoma, former member of this committee, a distinguished member. Welcome, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I tell you, if I'd known you were going to have such splendid digs, I might have tried to stay on. So it's a wonderful hearing room. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, as a former member of the House Budget Committee, I've consistently supported responsible and balanced legislation to get our long-term fiscal house in order and ultimately pay down the nation's daunting level of debt. However, to make real progress toward tackling our nation's debt problem, we must enact reforms to save and sustain mandatory programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. There's no question that our country's major mandatory programs are a significant driver of our debt. In fact, the CBO estimated last April that in 2018, the federal government would spend 4% more than the year before to fulfill benefits promised to Americans enrolled in these programs. And over the coming decade, mandatory spending is projected to continue growing at an average annual rate of 5.5%, reaching $7 trillion in 2028. Social Security, Medicare, and net interest account for more than 2/3 of that increase. According to the boards of trustees for Social Security and Medicare, both are due to become insolvent within the foreseeable future if no changes are made. In response to this grim reality, I've again introduced legislation to save Social Security. H.R. 289 would create a bipartisan and bicameral commission tasked with recommending reforms to ensure Social Security is solvent for at least 75 years. Certainly the only way to avoid painful cuts to beneficiaries later is to make small changes to safety net programs today. The longer we avoid this challenge, the more expensive and painful the solutions will become, and the deeper the debt left to our children and grandchildren. As a ranking Republican of Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and related agencies, I believe we must continue to prioritize robust funding for disease research and prevention. In fiscal year 2019, Congress increased the budget for NIH by $2 billion, building upon 3 previous increases of $2 to $3 billion each fiscal year. Congress has also maintained strong funding for the Center for Disease Control disease prevention programs, working to prevent chronic disease and address global health issues such as malaria and AIDS and the AIDS epidemic. These expenditures actually save money and lives. As I've often said, you're much more likely to die in a pandemic than a terrorist attack. So while we want to look for savings, this is an area I think we need to continue to invest. In writing the budget for fiscal year 2020, I urge members of this committee to prioritize continued sustained funding for these important agencies and programs, recognizing that the funding for disease research and prevention is an investment that generates tremendous benefits for society. And in that regard, I'd like to submit for the record an article by Jed Manichurian on the benefits of this continued investment.
Without objection, so
Thank you,
ordered.
Mr. Chairman. Unlike other constituencies, the federal government has a unique government-to-government relationship with Native American tribal governments that is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court case law, and reinforced by numerous federal statutes, treaties, and government-to-government agreements. Advance appropriations for the Indian Health Service would ensure that the trust responsibility is not abrogated by congressional indecision over annual appropriations process. The most recent government shutdown caused significant jeopardy to the health and safety of Native Americans due to the lack of funding for the IHS, BIA law enforcement, and other crucial BIA services. With respect to the IHS, the shutdown destabilized Native health delivery and access to health care providers, damaging tribal government operations and impacting families, children, and individuals. Nearly every year since 2003, the budget resolution has limited how much and for what purpose advanced appropriations can be made. Indian Health Service and BIA must be included in future budget resolutions to ensure these agencies, tribal governments, and urban Indian health care providers can continue to improve the quality of and expand access to health and other services. Finally, as a senior member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, I believe we must support a robust military force postured to meet the challenges and threats of the 21st century. Indeed, Congress has no greater responsibility than to provide for our military with the training and resources it needs to meet growing security challenges around the world. However, in the face of unprecedented fiscal challenges, a broader discussion and debate must take place that includes not only the cost of weapon systems, but the cost to sustain them over their life cycle. I urge you to consider these costs in your deliberations. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. I thank you for your time in this forum in which I was able to present my views.
Thank you, Mr. Cole, and I believe the ranking member has a question of the witness.
Representative Case, in his testimony this morning, I think did a pretty good job of explaining the two choices that we have, feed the beast or starve the beast, or some sweet spot in between. So my question of you, Mr. Cole, who happen to chair and now rank on one of the, arguably one of the real important subcommittees, not that anything is less important than others, but Labor H is a very important subcommittee, deals with a lot of things important to the American public. And sometimes we get into big shouting matches and fights over spending as a general term. But in the case of your subcommittee, there is spending within that subcommittee, namely in NIH, that can actually bend the cost curve in the out years on one of the key factors of facing our budget, and that's healthcare expense. So I want to give you just a moment to articulate just what happens when we are able to do really good research, whether you want to call it a moonshot or not, on something like an Alzheimer's or some of these other great medical issues facing our country, and the impact they have, say, a generation or two from now?
It's a great question. As you know, you were vice chairman of that committee, and so you know these topics better than most. And let me just take the example you mentioned of Alzheimer's. Currently, the federal government spends about $257 billion a year, mostly through Medicaid, to look after Alzheimer's patients. And that cost is projected to go to $1.1 trillion by 2050. So getting ahead of this, if you can just delay the onset, not just find a cure, just delay the onset, because this hits so many people late in life, you would actually lower the cost by 42% if you could delay it for 5 years. If you could cure it, obviously that's the right thing to do in humanitarian reasons, but it's the smart thing to do. So on that committee in the last 4 years, we've made that a priority. We've literally quadrupled Alzheimer's research funding, going from $500 million to about $2.4 billion. And that's been done in a very bipartisan manner. Again, these are investments that Republicans and Democrats alike know will save them money. You know, how much better, I'm old enough, sadly, to have lived in a world where polio was pretty common. Now there's fewer than 20 cases a year in the entire globe. That's direct result of biomedical research. How many lives have been improved? How much money has been saved? You can go on, and we happen to be at the cusp right now because of the mapping of the human genome, where we are on the verge of extraordinary progress. Now, I will tell you, in some cases, that's going to complicate your job because we're going to live a lot longer. We already are. I mean, the largest generation in American history is also going to live longer than any previous generation. And so that's created problems for Medicare and Social Security that just simply weren't anticipated. That's why I would also urge you, while we do this research, to look at these fundamental safety programs. And I remind you, the last time we did this in '83, Ronald Reagan was president, Tip O'Neill was our speaker. They worked together. The proposal we have is actually very similar to the one that they enacted. And I think you would probably get, minor reduction in benefits and additional income into these systems as well. We're going to have to look at both sides of these. But again, disease research holds, honestly, the answer to many, many of our challenges in Medicare and Medicaid long term.
I thank the gentleman. It's now an honor to recognize Ms. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Hearn.
Yes, first I want to thank my colleague from Oklahoma for being here today and testifying before us. I could not agree more that we have a major spending problem in this country. The Associated Press, ironically, just yesterday reported that from October through January, government revenues totaling $1.11 trillion, down 1.7% from the same period a year ago. But government spending was $1.15 trillion, up 8.8% from the same period a year ago. As a lifelong business person, there's really only three things you can do to correct a financial problem. You either grow revenues, cut expenses, or some combination thereof. Under this current CBO projections, the federal government will collect the extraordinary sum of $46 trillion over the next 10 years. No country in the history of this world has ever collected more. And I guess my question is sort of a two-part. One is, does this surprise you that spending is up 8.8% year over year?
It disappoints me. It doesn't surprise me. And again, I go back and where's it going up? If you actually look at fiscal year discretionary spending, 2010, and define defense and OCO spending, overseas, we're actually spending less today than we were 9 years ago on defense. And in non-defense, we're actually spending, and this is after the budget agreements of last year, less than we were in 2010. The difference is all mandatory programs and interest on the national debt. 2010, the mandatory programs were round numbers about 1.9 trillion. This year, they'll be about 2.6 trillion. Then throw in the deficit, the interest on the debt, which back then was running around 190 billion. This year, it'll be 300 plus. I think 312 is the latest number I saw. So I think, we have a lot of arguments about spending through the appropriations process. The real elephant in the room is the thing that nobody wants to talk about. What are you going to do to either sustain or reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid? Those three programs are over 60% of all federal spending. So the idea we can balance the budget without going back and looking at things that are politically popular but fiscally unsustainable, I think is just a myth. And the longer we put it off, the worse the problem that you outline is going to be.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with my colleague, and I think we all agree, and I appreciate my colleague from Hawaii and his comments as well. It's our responsibility as representatives of the people who fund our great government that we have to be greater stewards of the taxpayer dollars, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cole, give you a little background. My sister-in-law has just recently been diagnosed with breast cancer, and she's going through all that. And like you do, you research all the current things going on. I'm wondering, how do we, maybe not streamline, but how do we ensure that there's collaboration between these different groups that we are funding? Because it seems to me a lot of people are going down the same path that somebody else went down. Is there any way to ensure with dollars that we provide these groups that are doing research, maybe these hospitals or universities, that they are in fact collaborating and they're not just reinventing the wheel, and that we can find, it just seems to me there's a lot of waste, or maybe not waste, just duplication.
Well, I think that's a great question. We actually work pretty closely with the NIH on this. When I was chairman, and I know our new chairman, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Rosa DeLore, will be taking that subcommittee out to the NIH. We have hearings with them every year. We really do pay attention to this for exactly the reason that you mentioned. There is the risk of duplication. Now, again, the research that they put out is all peer-reviewed. We don't, as Congress, we don't pick this or that research project. So we've kept the process in a bipartisan sense very clean of steering money to our favorite institutions or what have you. And so I think both sides should be commended in that. But we also, are pretty clear with the NIH directors and the people at the various institutes. Look, we have to see results for investments of this size. You have to use these dollars wisely. And again, I would tell you, you mentioned cancer, what an awful thing. 65% of the people that get cancer today, and 1.6 million Americans get it every year, are going to be cancer survivors. You want to compare the numbers 30 years ago to that or 20 years ago. So I'm not going to tell you we haven't made mistakes or gone down blind alleys. Frankly, blind alleys are part of research sometimes. But the reality is this is research that has made life better. And while disease or, research is expensive, just try disease. That's really expensive, the cost associated with that for any American who has the misfortune to have that, and frankly, the role the government rightly plays in trying to help them do that. So again, I just tend to think if you look dollar for dollar, these investments have paid off for the American people, but we'll always be trying to make them more efficiently and protect that very precious taxpayer dollar.
Thank the gentleman. Now, it's my honor to recognize Ms. Plaskett of the Virgin Islands for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee. Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to present a brief statement of my views about what the budget should look like for the upcoming fiscal year. Budgets are moral documents. They're statements about where we want our future to look like and where we're going to spend our resources. It sets the stage for whether this country will continue to lead. I'll start by saying that over the long term, this will require cancellation of sequestration, rethinking current tax policy, modernizing our military, and investing in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and jobs. I want to use the rest of my time to address specific areas of need, particularly in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and how your budget impacts the territories. Congress does not always acknowledge the contribution of the territories to our nations, but the geographic importance of the territories and our own brain drain shows the contributions, along with our high participation rate in the United States Armed Forces. Each of the territories has had at least one major disaster declared by the President in the last 2 years. Of course, we're all very familiar with the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Recovery is still ongoing, and I applaud the excellent work that's been done. However, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge how much work remains in order to fulfill the promise of full recovery and indeed begin rebuilding. Many of the challenges are a result of factors beyond the control of government, such as geographic isolation. But some challenges we face are exacerbated by federal policy, which are within our power in Congress to change. With an economy that primarily relies on tourism now, the Virgin Islands depends heavily on infrastructure. Given the catastrophic level of damage suffered, the recovery of our islands will hinge on the level of support from Congress to rebuild and maintain infrastructure, roads, and particularly our ports. The budget must call for significant investment in infrastructure, with a piece of it geared toward assistance to rural and traditionally underserved areas, including the U.S. territories. For example, the Territorial Highway Program has been unfairly singled out in recent years for funding cuts, while states and the District of Columbia have received significant increases. I have continued to urge my colleagues to correct this inequity for years. Along with transportation and other infrastructure, a great many of the schools in our country are at the end of their life cycle. School buildings, classrooms, equipment, among other things, are crucial to our children's funding. A lack of significant infrastructure in school infrastructure in the Virgin Islands was an enabling factor in the resulting loss of a large percentage of schools after our storms in the Virgin Islands. As of now, we still have many students who are living in temporary structures, and it would seem more fiscally responsible to put the money into the schools now so that when ensuing and, God forbid, additional natural disasters occur, those schools are resilient and can continue to stand. Another area of support in the budget makes fiscal and long-term responsibility is healthcare, specifically regarding Medicaid. The arbitrarily high local match required of the territories under Medicaid has imposed severe and unstable financial demands on the territory. In addition, with overall federal Medicaid funding to the states and DC is open-ended, Medicaid programs in the territories are subject to annual federal funding caps. Once the cap is reached, the territory must assume the full cost. Up to 30% of the population could lose access to Medicaid in September 3rd with the Affordable Care Act allotment expires, and access to Medicaid be lost to the territories. Congress must act to prevent this potential calamity before September 30th. That, along with CMS reimbursement rates from the 1980s, the Virgin Islands' lack of being able to be part of the DISH, the disproportionate share for hospitals, means that for the hospitals in the territories, which were also destroyed in the hurricanes, they have a large portion of uncompensated care for those individuals who do not have Medicaid or health insurance in the territories. The islands' territories also face unique security threats. So funding for Coast Guard funding, Homeland Security entities, et cetera, are important. I see that I'm running out of time, but there are areas related to federal tax policy playing a crucial role, as well as increased funding to NOAA. Increase in funding for NOAA's Endangered Species Act, marine protection, essential fish habitation consultations are necessary to address the backlog and permitting process, which negates us having an ability to have developments move forward in the territory. I will submit a full written testimony, which has much more, particularly in the area of tax cuts and the unintended consequences to the territories due to some of the tax laws. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for her testimony. Does anyone have a question of the witness? Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Olson of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth. Thank you, Ranking Republican Leader Womack, and every member of this important committee for allowing me to share my thoughts about the budget. I come from the most diverse district in America. If the census comes through in 2020 as expected, the election in 2022 in my home district of Texas 22 will be 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, divided equally between Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Caucasian Americans. Everyone in these groups have concerns and some have fears about Medicare for all. We all know the drivers of our uncontrolled national debt. It's 3 programs that we have to pay for. We made a promise. Social Security for retirees, Medicaid for less fortunate, and Medicare for senior citizens for their health. Medicare is in the worst shape of all those 3 financially. Medicare for all destroys Medicare as we know it. It ensures a rapid bankruptcy, meaning Medicare for none. The Mercatus Center had a study. They put the number at $32 trillion over 10 years for Medicare for all. New York Times, not the most conservative paper out there, has said Medicare for all will have increased, possibly higher taxes for people on Medicaid, new taxes for people who pay for the insurance out of their pocket, TRICARE for our veterans, gone, and private insurance through employers, gone. Meaning the promise, if you like your health care, you can keep it, is being broken. Leader of Medicare for All in the Senate, Senator Sanders, admits that his proposal will cost $1.38 trillion per year. That's $13.8 trillion over the 10-year budget window. Our seniors know that expanding membership to Medicare, their exclusive program for their last years of lives, will lead to lower quality of care and less access to care. You can't put millions of youngsters into Medicare without diminishing seniors' care. The math just doesn't add up. In addition to risking Medicare for seniors, all people back home have asked me the whole time I've been in Congress, over 10 years now, the same question. If my family has to have a balanced budget, if my business has to have a balanced budget, if my local city government has to have a balanced budget, if my state government has to have a balanced budget, why in the heck does DC not have to have a balanced budget? And balanced budgets are hard. My old boss, Phil Graham, had a great quote about balanced budget. He said, Balancing a budget is like going to heaven. Everybody wants to do it, but nobody wants to do what it takes to get there. When my party had controlled this committee, we balanced our budget within the budget window. Some 10 years, some as low as 7 years. Those were tough, tough votes. Tough, tough choices. I asked this committee to please make your goal to balance our budget within the 10-year window. You don't need to have this committee balance the budget after the world ends in 12 years or after Jesus comes back. Make the tough choices now. Show the American people we get it. I have to take some questions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Does anyone have a question for the witness? Thank you very much, Mr. Olson. Just so you know the order now, it's Mr. Malinowski, Ms. Johnson, Mr. Cohen, the next three witnesses. Thank you both, Ms. Plaskett and Mr. Olson, and I now recognize gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth. Thank you, members of the committee. I want to raise a small number of issues that I think are particularly important to the 7th District of New Jersey, and I think important to the country as a whole. And the first is the need for a budget that invests in transportation infrastructure, in particular public transportation. All of us, I think, know this, and certainly those of us who have traveled to other countries know this, that America's infrastructure, once the envy of the world, is losing its battle against time, growth, weather, and wear. And no state suffers more from our underinvestment in public infrastructure than New Jersey, where twice as many people use public transportation as the national average. To get to and from New York, 200,000 of us a day still depend on just 2 rail tracks across the Portal Bridge and through the Hudson River Tunnel, 2 structures that were a marvel when they were built in 1910, but are crumbling today. If we fail to repair this vital transportation corridor in time, we'll be dealing a crippling blow to the economy of our region and our country. Even a partial shutdown of these tunnels would disrupt not just passenger rail, but car and truck traffic up and down the East Coast, making commutes virtually impossible for tens of thousands of people, diminishing property values and driving away businesses in one of the most economically vital areas of our country. And so I ask that the Budget Committee support significant investments in our nation's transportation infrastructure, particularly the all-important Gateway project. I also ask for full funding for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Flood Risk Management Program. This is especially important to residents in my district. For years, homeowners near the Rahway River Basin and Greenbrook Subbasin in my district have lived under the constant threat of flooding that devastates businesses and homes whenever there are heavy rains. The last major flood was in 2011 when Hurricane Irene ravaged the East Coast. The town of Cranford in my district lost 1,600 homes to significant damage. Funding would enable urgently needed flood control work to be done in these areas and others in similar situations. In January, our mayors presented a proposed solution to the Army Corps of Engineers and are now pushing for a feasibility study to be completed. This will get us one step closer to authorizing construction on the Rahway River Basin so that we never again have to be pulling people out of second-story windows in the communities that I represent because of flooding that can be predicted and should be prevented. Finally, Mr. Chairman, there is a profound debate that we are having in this very body right now about the words we speak and the example that we set when it comes to bigotry and intolerance. But it's not just what we say as leaders that matters, it's what we do as legislators. Anti-Semitic incidents in the United States surged by 57% in 2017, and overall hate crimes rose by 17%. In my district, white nationalist and anti-Semitic propaganda has appeared from community bulletin boards to graffiti in public schools. People whose minds have been poisoned by this extremism have threatened and committed brazen acts of terror, including the deadliest attack on Jewish Americans in our country's history. We have invested enormous resources as a country to prevent foreign terrorists from conducting attacks on our soil, and we have been remarkably successful. We have devoted vastly fewer resources to preventing attacks by domestic extremists, even though they have claimed roughly as many lives as groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS within the United States since 9/11. The Trump administration has actually proposed to cut funds for countering violent extremism at the Department of Homeland Security. So let's make sure that our budgets for the Justice Department, including the FBI, and for DHS, are adequate to meeting the threat that our citizens actually face from both foreign and domestic extremist groups, and that there is an expectation of greater parity when it comes to which are prioritized. I look forward to working with you to shape our response to this and all the other challenges I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Does anyone have a question of the witness? Thank you very much. Now pleased to recognize the chairwoman of the Science Committee, Ms. Bernice Johnson of Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all. Since submission of the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request has been delayed, it is obviously not possible to comment on its impact on the nation's research and innovation enterprise. However, if the Trump administration's past budget submissions are any guide, and I fear that they are, this year's request will continue the trend of devaluing the important role that federal investments make in R&D and play in advancing our economy, preparing our workforce for the jobs of the 21st century, and maintaining our national security. In the President's fiscal 2019 budget request, we witnessed a troubling disregard for science as massive cuts were made to vital research and development project funding. Unfortunately, we again expect to see more proposed cuts in crucial funding areas like R&D, innovation, education, and technology in fiscal year 2020 request. As a result, my highest priority request to the Budget Committee as it works to craft the budget resolution is that we reject further cuts to civilian R&D and science and technology programs. And indeed, I would hope that you would increase our federal R&D investments in these programs. The federal investments are vital to our scientific enterprise, and further cutbacks would put our nation's global competitiveness in jeopardy. We need to invest in our research agencies, NASA, NOAA, the NSF, NIST, DOE, EPA, and others that enhance America's economic strength, address our national priorities, advance knowledge, and inspire our youth. The Science, Space, and Technologies Committee's budgetary priorities are laid out in more detail in the views and estimates that we will be submitting to the Budget Committee later this week. In view of the time constraints, I will just mention a few of them here today. First, the Department of Energy funds a wide range of research, development, demonstration, and commercial application activities. Given the President's repeated promises to revitalize American infrastructure and the need to transition to a clean energy economy, we believe strong investments across DOE's energy, RDD, and CA activities should be top priority. Second, though a few will point to the successes of the Environmental Protection Agency in protecting public health and the environment over the past 40 years as a reason to stop pushing for stricter limits on pollution, it is important to note that these protections must be sustained with robust funding for the agency, maintaining clean air and water, and protecting our most vulnerable populations from environmental contaminants is a continuing endeavor. We must be investing more and should be investing more in EPA, not less. With respect to climate change, though our understanding of the physical drivers of climate change has improved, there is a clear need for continued sustained funding for research at agencies such as NOAA and NASA, that which will help inform robust solutions to one of our nation's greatest challenges. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, has long been recognized as the world leader in aeronautics and space research and exploration. We support robust funding that will allow NASA to maintain a balanced and healthy portfolio in programs in aeronautics, Earth and space science, technology development, and human space flight and exploration, as well as allowing investments in the infrastructure that will be required if NASA is to carry out the task our nation has given it. We encourage the Budget Committee to maintain robust funding for NOAA across all line offices, especially for environmental data collection and scientific research needs to ensure the agency can continue to meet its critical mission. It is also imperative that funding for the next generation of NOAA's weather satellites be maintained to ensure that those satellites programs remain on track for a successful development and launch. The National Science Foundation is the only federal agency to support basic research across all fields of science and engineering. At a time of increasing global competition and national urgency in critical research areas like quantum science, artificial intelligence, the future of work, and climate change, NSF should be funded at levels that allow it to support the cutting-edge research that makes the U.S. the global leader in innovation. NIST is one of the most important but underappreciated agencies in our government. The work NIST does with the relatively modest budget yields incalculable benefits to the competitiveness of U.S. industry across all sectors, while also protecting the security, privacy, safety, and well-being of all Americans. NIST is worthy.
The witness could wrap up. Your time has expired. If you could wrap
Thank
up,
you,
that'd be
Mr.
appreciated.
Chairman.
Thank you.
I simply ask for your sincere investigation and support for these areas. Thank you very much.
I thank the witness very much. Any questions of Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Flores?
I don't have a question, but I do want to make sure that we don't leave the wrong impression in the hearing record regarding the gentlelady's comments regarding research funding. The President's budget has historically requested decreases in research funding. That said, Congress has actually increased funding in important basic research over the course of the last 4 years. So just want to make sure the record reflects that Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has placed a priority on basic research funding. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and thank the witness. I now recognize Mr. Cohen of Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee, Ranking Member Womack and others, for providing us this opportunity to address congressional priorities. Firstly, I'd like to say that if you see your person's budget, you know what they value. And I believe it's time that our budget aligns with the values of the American people and the needs of the American people. Defense spending is one of the primary areas in our budget. It takes a great deal of it. It's important, no question about it, but we have compelling needs at home that need prioritizing for more funding, even more so than defense. We must deal with, first of all, our own mortality. That's a special interest to each and every one of you, your own mortality, and a lesser included part of that is our health care, our health experiences, our health care, and how we deal with that. Secondly, we need to deal with education and educating our populace. Third, get people jobs, and we do that through a good infrastructure program, which we need to fund. Our infrastructure is crippling, and it's important to get goods to market and to help our commerce, and also to embrace diplomacy. You know, the likelihood that Congress also needs to end the school-to-prison pipeline, reduce recidivism, end the rape kit backlog, and support people who are getting clean from drugs. And we can do this by supporting programs in commerce, justice, and science. The likelihood of any one of us dying from heart attack or heart disease or stroke or diabetes or Alzheimer's or AIDS or whatever else is pretty darn good. The likelihood of us dying from a terrorist attack or in a war involving North Korea, Iran, or anybody else is pretty much nil. I'm not saying we don't need a defense budget, but there's a whole lot of fat in that defense budget. And the real enemy of the American people and of all the people on the globe is disease. And we need to do all we can to fight the disease. That's our real enemy. And the Defense Department against disease is the NIH and the CDC. And the more we can help the NIH and the CDC in doing funding on these catastrophic diseases, the more we are prioritizing what the real enemy is and what our real purpose should be, keeping people healthy and keeping them alive for a longer period of time and keeping their relatives and their loved ones, et cetera, alive too. We need to maintain our safety nets, Medicare, Medicaid, it's part of that health program, and food assistance programs. It also relates well to it. If you don't have a good diet and you don't have an opportunity, you're going to have disease that's going to follow with it. There are 15 million American households, 11.6%, who are food insecure or were sometime during 2017. That means 40 million people, including 6.5 million children, live in food insecure households. The wealthiest country on earth should not be letting people go to sleep hungry. So we need to support SNAP payments and any other payments we have to see to it that people have a chance to get food. And we should try to eliminate food deserts and see that people can get fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, and eat better. Not have a bunch of sodium-filled and carbohydrate-filled fast foods. Congress needs to invest in diplomacy and foreign aid as well. As our great former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis said during testimony before the Senate Armed Forces Committee, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I'll need more ammunition ultimately. So I think it's a cost-benefit ratio. The more we put into the State Department's diplomacy, the less we have to put into the military budget as we deal with the outcome of an apparent American withdrawal from the international scene. Diplomacy and foreign assistance saves service members' lives and saves the United States government money by putting less soldiers in harm's way and doing the right thing to try to head off crises before they occur. I believe it's contrary to what our priority should be when the Department of Defense receives over half of our discretionary spending and every other department and agency has to fight over the scraps of whatever's left. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you and just stress all I can. And I know it's a special interest to each of you individually and your families and to every one of your constituents to make fighting disease and improving health outcomes the #1 priority of our budget, because that's what we need to be doing. Urge the committee to do this, and I thank you so much for your efforts and your time, and I look forward to many, many years from now when Mr. Yarmouth retires and his picture will be up on the wall with Ms. Black, Mr. Ryan, Mr. Spratt, and others.
I thank the gentleman very much for his testimony and that comment. Yes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Representative Cohen, just a couple of quick questions. Appreciate you being here and taking the time. We all have busy schedules during the day, so thanks for coming here and addressing the committee. You outlined some of the issues that you believe are pressing and important and things that we should prioritize as a Congress. I share your concern about the well-being of the American people and health issues. You know, my dad's a polio survivor. I'm a cancer survivor. You've got hundreds of stories, right, in your family and network. We all do. My question for you is, you described the extent to which there's waste in defense. Would you also agree that there's waste in non-defense discretionary spending?
There probably is, but I have not seen as outrageous of reports as the reports I've seen over the years on defense, whether it's toilet seats on planes or other examples that have been cited, and cost overruns on airplanes.
Well, I think there's a significant number of reports that suggest there's waste throughout government. I would agree with you that there's waste in the Department of Defense, but I would say I would suggest it's probably equally so in non-defense discretionary. But here's my question: for any additional spending that you think is necessary for the CDC, you mentioned other healthcare priorities, fighting disease, all laudable goals in society. Are you suggesting dollar-for-dollar cuts out of DOD in order to pay for any increases that you're suggesting there?
I am indeed, because I think it's our first line of defense, and it's the real enemy. I'm a polio survivor also.
Oh.
Now, Dr. Salk and Dr. Sabin kind of took care of that, and
Right.
the Gates is a nice trio.
Sure.
But, you know, you've got heart disease, stroke, you name it. And you just pick up the paper any day and look at the obits. Those are people we lost, and they could have been put off. We're all going to go eventually, but we can delay it, put it off, and make it better. And I just think that's our first priority.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify about what we're talking about here in order to get, because we're sitting here looking at a $1.3 trillion deficit, right, for this fiscal year, we're almost $1 trillion of deficit spending this fiscal year. I'm trying to look out and see, well, what are we going to do next year in order to control spending? And so that's one option, right? If those who want non-defense discretionary to go up, they say, well, we want dollar for dollar cuts in defense. If we want defense to go up, maybe dollar for dollar cuts in non-defense discretionary. I guess my question for you is, how do you propose we get a handle on spending and balancing the budget going forward if what you just suggested would be to increase non-defense discretionary, do dollar for dollar cuts out of defense, we're still going to be spending $1 trillion more than we're taking in. So what's our way forward when we're staring at $22 trillion of debt?
Well, there's a lot of ways, and I think revenue is a major way, and I think a lot of the tax cuts that we just passed were unnecessary, wasteful, didn't spur the economy on, it was a short blip, and we ought to put taxes back on the wealthiest people. And while, you know, what was proposed by one of my freshman colleagues might be a little high, the top rate ought to go up, because people earning over $10 million, over $20 million can and should pay more, and the estate tax never should have been changed. Even when the Democrats did it, it should go back to the level of 3.5 million single exemption and $7 million marital exemption. 60% of the wealth in this country is passed through estate shifts by inheritance. People ought to earn that money. You know, Ivanka Trump just said people don't want a handout. They'd rather work and earn their own money. They don't want to be given something. But 60% of the wealth in this country is passed by inheritance. And that's where the estate tax comes in, and we could raise a lot of money there by putting it back to the right areas where we did and not give tax breaks to the lucky sperm club.
Do you think there's $1 trillion of revenue on the table in tax increases?
There certainly can be. We had $1 trillion of deficit created because of tax decreases.
So the answer then, what I'm hearing is increase non-defense discretionary, to cut defense, to increase taxes to the tune of a significant amount of money, upwards of $1 trillion. That's the suggestion?
You know, I'm kind of like, I guess, Everett Dirksen, I think it was, and it might have been, you know, $1 million here and $1 trillion there, and you've got real money. I don't know, trillions and billions. It could be billions. I don't want to go with trillions, but whatever it is. I mean, there's money that we gave away in the tax cuts, and there's money we gave to a bunch of people who are going to inherit money that they otherwise would not have when we reduce that rate. The rate's the big thing. It's not the exemption level. It's the rate going from 55% down to 35%. That gives the billionaire folks hundreds of millions of dollars to pass on.
So last
don't
one.
want it because they want to work.
With my time decreasing, I obviously believe that the tax cuts have paid for themselves. I think CBO report has suggested such. I think we've more than paid for the tax cuts that have been put in place to then generate the revenue that we're now seeing with 3% economic growth last year. So I'd obviously respectfully disagree, but I thank you for your time.
You're welcome, sir.
Expired. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack, for the opportunity to be with you today and to address the funding priorities for the House Agriculture Committee for fiscal year 2020. The committee succeeded in passing the 2018 Farm Bill in the waning days of the last Congress. Together with our Republican colleagues, we worked extremely hard to make sure that every program contained in this bill was an effective, transparent, and fiscally responsible mechanism to improve the lives of all Americans. The bill was budget neutral, and it passed with overwhelming and historic bipartisan support. In the House, more members voted for the 2018 Farm Bill than have ever voted for a farm bill in history. What we did in that legislation was done thoughtfully and with input from stakeholders across the country. As the Budget Committee is aware, the 2018 Farm Bill directs USDA to implement a broad range of programs that deal with the process of producing food, fiber, and fuel across America. These programs include critical nutrition assistance for working families, new tools to prevent animal diseases, improved risk management for farmers, conservation and renewable energy incentives, forest management tools, foreign market development assistance, research into emerging crops like hemp, and resources for young, veteran, and underserved producers, support to combat opioid addiction, and provide rural mental health services, and investment in academic research and innovation in our 1862, 1890, and 1994 land-grant universities. Simply put, this bill contains programs that directly and indirectly serve every single American. These programs are critical given the various situations so many in our agricultural industry face. And whether that's a challenge from volatile weather and potential livestock and plant pests and disease, or falling farm income due to trade disputes, The Farm Bill helps families in those rural communities deal with the adverse conditions facing them. I do want to urge the committee to acknowledge the seriousness of these challenges and through your process, maintain the fiscal commitments that we've made to fighting them through the Farm Bill in the coming year. I thank you for the opportunity to be here and to address the committee. Please answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
thank the gentlelady. Any questions for the witness? Thank you once again. Just review the order now for the next few witnesses. It's Ms. Miller, Ms. Scanlon, Dr. Bouchon, and Dr. Burgess. Ms. Miller, you're recognized for West Virginia. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Again, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack, for having me here today. It's my pleasure to be here. Today, I want to share with you issues that are critical to my district and the importance of having a budget that supports the health and well-being of our communities while also being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I will focus my remarks on 3 central areas: career and technical education, the energy industry, and infrastructure. Across the United States, career and technical education programs, known as CTE, have helped prepare students for the workforce. I am sure that many of you have seen this within your own districts. These programs incorporate what students are learning in the classroom and give them real-world applications by developing skills needed to enter the working world upon leaving high school. In my home state of West Virginia, 37% of all students have completed at least one CTE program and have earned more than 14,000 industry-recognized credentials. Further, students who participate in CTE programs are more likely to graduate high school as well. Whether during high school or after, as part of a continuing education, investing in CTE will help equip our children and grandchildren with the skills and knowledge they need to succeed. The demand for a skilled and educated workforce is continuing to grow, and programs like CTE help ensure we have the people ready to succeed in their journey in life. It's no secret that the opioid crisis is devastating communities around the country, and especially in my home state of West Virginia. It has torn families apart and taken too many of our children. Along with the toll taken on family and friends, our opioid epidemic has taken too many out of the workforce. In addition to giving students the ability to enter the workforce, programs like CTE can help give young adults plans for the future, hope outside of drugs, and keep our students on a path towards success. I also want to stress the importance for any proposed budget to protect our energy industry and those who work in it. West Virginia is an energy state. It employs our people and powers our communities. The previous administration instituted regulations that devastated the coal industry in my state and eliminated many precious jobs. We cannot go back down that road. That is why I'm worried about proposals like the Green New Deal. I urge the committee to not consider overreaching proposals such as this when crafting the budget of fiscal year 2020. Plans like the Green New Deal pose an imminent threat to the economy of my state and the livelihoods of my constituents. In West Virginia, nearly 30,000 people work in the energy industry, and 93% of our electricity comes from coal. I urge the committee to reject any proposals that would regulate the energy industry out of business. We all have a duty to protect our planet and to leave our home better than we found it for our children and our grandchildren. So let's incentivize innovation, not taxation and regulation, when it comes to protecting our environment. We've lifted so many people out of poverty and built the America of the 21st century, but we still have much more to do. In my district, companies are beginning to work on taking previously toxic material and transforming it into inert rock, pure clean water, and rare earth elements used in everything from pacemakers to cell phones. Again, We need a budget that incentivizes innovation that will deliver real solutions that we can implement today. Finally, I ask the committee to include money for infrastructure in fiscal year 2020 budget. Across the United States, we have crumbling roads and bridges. My district lacks easy access to highways and interstates, which make it difficult for my constituents from the most rural parts of the 3rd District to access services in more populous areas of the state. We need to innovate our infrastructure and invest in our roads, railways, and rivers to connect our state and transport our resources. There is a great need all across the country to improve and maintain thoroughfares while enhancing safety. Any federal money towards infrastructure can have a positive economic impact in our local communities through increasing growth and creating jobs. As an important part of infrastructure, I also ask the committee to consider the inclusion of rural broadband in the fiscal year 2020 budget. Many communities across the United States lack reliable access to the internet. I was pleased to see Facebook's announcement this week that it will be laying 275 miles of fiber in West Virginia. I know Governor Justice and Senator Capito worked tirelessly on bringing this project to fruition, and I hope we can continue efforts like this across the United States. Increasing connectivity in rural America can preserve the rural way of life while also growing local economies, delivering a quality education, promoting tourism, and enhancing telehealth. Thank you again, Chairman and Ranking Member Womack. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady for her testimony. Any questions of the witness?
One quick question, Mr. Chairman. To my friend from West Virginia, thanks for being here today. Thanks for taking time. Would you agree with the assessment that in the early 1870s, the average American family spent about more than 80% of its income on food, clothing, and shelter, and that today, after a roughly threefold increase in per capita energy usage and a nearly 14-fold increase in real per capita GDP, Americans spend a third of their income on these basic necessities? In other words, is fossil fuels making lives better in this country and around the world?
Fossil fuels do make lives better.
And can I also ask if you would agree that according to a 2015 report by the International Energy Agency that an estimated 1.2 billion people, 17% of the global population, remain without electricity, and 2.7 billion people, 38% of the global population, put their health at risk through reliance on the traditional use of solid biomass for cooking? Things like that. Do we make the world a lot better when we export our fossil fuels and our energy around the world?
Absolutely. It's most important.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I'm going to defer now. We have two members of leadership who are going to, or at least scheduled to testify, so I'm going to defer to them right now and interrupt the schedule. So I will recognize Assistant Speaker Lujan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our ranking member, thank you for the honor of being before the Budget Committee. I also want to recognize Chairman Pallone of the Energy and Commerce Committee, who invited me to testify on the priorities of the committee for the 116th Congress. The Energy and Commerce Committee has a broad mandate. Our work touches nearly every aspect of Americans' lives. That is why our committee knows that there is much work to be done. We must address our changing climate, preserve an open internet, rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, and ensure that every individual in this country has affordable and high-quality health care coverage. Our agenda will be ambitious, and most importantly, it will ensure that all those living in the U.S. will be able to reach their full potential. In this new majority, it feels fitting to draw strength and wisdom from an extraordinary former Dean of the House, our very own Chairman Dingell, who often said, "It is imperative that we not compromise public safety in the name of being penny wise and pound foolish." I cannot agree more. Our budget must reflect serious, sustained investments to fight climate change. Climate change represents an existential threat to our future, our way of life, and our economy. We simply cannot wait any longer to act. The federal government, our national labs, and universities are unique and invaluable resources that we must mobilize to address the climate change crisis in partnership with state and local governments and the private sector. The Energy and Commerce Committee will act to reaffirm America's role as the leader in the research, development, demonstration, and deployment of clean and renewable energies. Our budget must also recognize the importance of a free flow of information. A free and open internet has revolutionized the way we do business, changed how we learn and communicate with loved ones, and expand our ability to access information. We must keep this innovative spirit alive, which is why the Energy and Commerce Committee will pass the Save the Internet Act to restore the net neutrality protections President Trump's Federal Communications Commission repealed. We must also affirm our commitment to modernizing the nation's infrastructure to create jobs, promote economic growth, and protect public health and the environment. The Energy and Commerce Committee will take action on legislation like the Lift America Act, which makes key investments in modernizing an inadequate broadband system and the electric grid, and expanding renewable energy infrastructure and healthcare, and cleaning contaminated drinking water. We will decisively act on healthcare. Our budget must make a steadfast commitment to ensure that every American can access quality healthcare, that every senior can afford their prescriptions, that every child is sent to a healthy school, that every person is covered no matter their pre-existing conditions. The Energy and Commerce Committee is hard at work unraveling the sabotage done to our healthcare system over the last few years, and especially under the last 2 years with this current administration. My colleagues are in the committee room right now discussing how we can strengthen health insurance markets, enroll more eligible individuals, and decrease the costs of coverage. But we won't stop there. While Republicans won't talk about what Americans can't have, Democrats want to talk about what Americans can be. We believe Americans can be healthy and prosperous, and how much money you make and where you live should not have a determination on your potential. I want to conclude my testimony today by recognizing the importance of this moment. And while I'm sure that Americans are not sitting on the edge of their sofas watching the budget hearing today, I want them to know that we are hard at work prioritizing the needs of the families so that everyone can live a better life. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. Any questions of the witness?
Quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, thank you for taking the time for being here out of your busy day. I appreciate your time. You rattled off a whole lot of priorities that I think were important for you in terms of whether it was pre-existing conditions, sort of healthcare for all, a number of different priorities. What is your suggestion for paying for these things? We have a $22 trillion of debt and over $1 trillion deficit we're looking at. What do you view as the way that we pay for those things? Is it cuts out of defense spending? Is it tax increases, or what are you suggesting?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the question, Congressman Roy. Just as when Democrats worked to pass the Affordable Care Act, sadly, when it was passed on pretty much a partisan vote in the House, that was a piece of legislation the Democrats worked to ensure that they were paid for. As a matter of fact, it was going to save money. Our Republican colleagues did not accept that debate. The facts associated with the Congressional Budget Office that were laid out that showed how it was paid for. So going forward, I would hope that as you characterize my priorities as mine alone, I would hope that these are shared priorities of both sides of the aisle in the Congress to help lower costs for the American people when it comes to health care, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, as well as lowering prescription drug prices. And in the same way that under the last Congress, under repeal efforts of the Affordable Care Act, that we do everything we can not to eliminate or completely gut Medicaid funding for the country, but that we actually look to bolster those initiatives and that we find ways to pay for them.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment. I think that any number of the studies I've looked at for Medicare for All or for other provisions that would talk about how we pay for health care, that I've seen studies saying there's $30 to $40 trillion of costs that we deal with respect to those kinds of plans. So that's why I'm just wondering how we would pay for that. My next question is on with respect to climate change. You suggested that we have a crisis or a problem that we're facing with climate change that's somewhat existential. Do you believe that we're facing a apocalyptic kind of situation with climate change?
Well, Mr. Roy, I know that you're also a supporter of our military and concerned with the national security. And I'd encourage you to read the briefings that are coming from the Department of Defense itself as it pertains to the safety and security, not just of our country, but of our soldiers. Most people agree that we need to act on this. As a matter of fact, 98% of climate scientists agree. The facts lead us where they need to. I think you're also a supporter of NASA and NOAA as we look at those important installations and the science and research that takes place. They're alone present those opportunities for the American people to read. And if you look at what they say in important federal agencies that we all support through our budgetary investments, those are where the facts are. I'm not a climate scientist, but I like to understand the importance of the science and the research that's taking place. And look, when the Department of Defense, NASA, NOAA, and climate scientists agree, it's something that the American people and the world should take notice of.
So if CO2 is the problem, and if that's what you're suggesting is that we've got a problem with respect to climate change, will you commit to pushing an all-nuclear power supply which would produce zero CO2?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Roy, I think that when we're looking at reducing emissions, there are many ideas that are on the table that will lead us to a reduced emission state. Currently, when you look at proposals, including those that have been objected to by Republicans, they also include generation from nuclear entities. But I think that we should have an honest conversation about what this is and what it's not. And there should be agreement amongst all of us that we need to reduce pollution, just as we did with the problems we had in the 1990s with the negative impacts to farmers across America with acid rain. When there were provisions put in place to reduce NOx and SOx in America, and the utilities and private sector of America said that it would bankrupt them, they actually exceeded their responsibilities. There's ways to get this done.
So from my perspective, and I'll just wrap up, I know we got to move on, is just if we have a CO2 crisis, I'm not suggesting that we do or don't, but if those who suggest we do, it would seem to me that we want to push clean burning natural gas, export clean burning natural gas around the world, which you are doing, and the innovation which is driving down CO2 production. In America, 25% reductions. Let's get it to India and China. And then let's adopt nuclear technology so that we can have zero emissions. But yet I don't see that from those on the other side that might say that we're going to have an apocalyptic end to times in 12 years because of CO2 reduction. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, if I just may, if Mr.
Gentleman
Roy
may
would
respond.
take a look at the Renewable Electricity Standard piece of legislation that I've authored and others, I think you might find that there's a reason that you should co-sponsor it, sir. So I'll be reaching out to the office of yourself and others and see if we could get you on board.
Happy to look at any legislation that would advance the interests of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like the record to reflect that in terms of the proposals that were laid out, the cost for the Green New Deal is roughly $93 trillion. The cost of Medicare for All is $40 some-odd trillion for a total of over $136 trillion. That total wealth of every man, woman, and child in this country is $108 trillion. Just wanted to show, wanted the American people to know what the cost is of these programs versus the total value of the families in this country. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. To thank the Assistant Speaker for his testimony. And now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Womack. It's an honor to appear before you today in my role as Vice Chair of the Committee on the Judiciary. The work of the Department of Justice, the federal courts, the Department of Homeland Security, and all of the programs overseen by the Judiciary Committee are vital to safeguarding the values upon which our country was built. While there may be disagreements with and sometimes sharp criticism of certain agencies, their leadership or priorities, I believe we can all agree on the fundamental importance of their missions. I urge this committee to fund these critical programs and agencies at levels appropriate to accomplish their important work. I'd like to highlight a few specific funding priorities that I hope you will consider favorably. To begin, we recommended funding the Executive Office for Immigration Review at a level that will address the overwhelming backlog of immigration cases. Perhaps no issue has caused more passionate debate in Congress than that of our country's broken immigration system. However, I trust we can all agree that regardless of how we believe immigration policies must be reformed, fair and timely adjudication of cases is necessary both to ensure access to justice and effective enforcement of our laws. Therefore, we recommend that the office be funded at a level appropriate to effectively administer its mission. In addition, while the House has already demonstrated a commitment to addressing this country's gun violence epidemic through the passage of H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, Congress can and must do more to ensure that guns do not fall into the hands of those who would commit violent acts. To that end, we should increase funding for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and allocate further resources to processing applications for regulated firearms in order to protect our communities. In December, Congress passed the bipartisan First Step Act to initiate urgently needed reforms to our criminal justice system, reducing federal incarceration and providing prisoners with rehabilitative programs to end recidivism is both a moral necessity and a fiscally prudent move. Criminal justice reform, if funded at appropriate levels, will save money, which can be invested to reduce crime and make our communities safer. Congress should fully fund the First Step Act and the Bureau of Prisons' efforts to expand rehabilitation reduction programs. I would also like to call attention to the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund, which announced that without additional funding, it will be unable to continue fully compensating claimants. Congress originally enacted the fund to compensate injuries and death suffered in the September 11th terrorist attacks. Congress subsequently expanded the fund to include responders and survivors who've become ill and died following exposure to the toxic debris released in that attack. Chairman Nadler intends to report H.R. 1327, which would authorize funding for the VCF through fiscal year 2090. We need to ensure sufficient funding so that first responders, survivors, and their families do not face financial ruin due to the ongoing health effects caused by the 9/11 attacks. And finally, I want to highlight the funding needs of the Legal Services Corporation, an agency with which I worked for over 30 years before coming to Congress last year. LSC, which provides civil legal representation to Americans living at or near poverty, has enjoyed bipartisan support since it was created in 1974. LSC funds legal aid organizations that cover every county in every state in our country, returning tax dollars back to communities to protect the most vulnerable, veterans and the elderly, children and domestic violence victims. Civil legal aid is one of the best anti-poverty programs that our country has. It protects individuals from losing housing or benefits. It helps families stay together and protects vulnerable family members from abusive relationships so they all can remain healthy and productive and contribute to our communities and economy. Civil legal aid stimulates economic growth, saving millions of dollars that would otherwise be spent on health care, foster care, emergency shelters, and law enforcement. These are only a few of the vital programs within the Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction. I trust you appreciate the important work of the departments overseen by Judiciary and their critical role in ensuring the constitutional rights and procedural safeguards that have protected our democracy for over 2 centuries. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Any questions of the witness? I now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear today before the committee to talk about the detrimental impact that Medicare for All would have on the federal budget and the health care of all Americans. As you know, Medicare for All would establish a government-run, single-payer health care system that would completely upend the health care system as Americans know it today. For example, H.R. 1384 would take away the health plans of more than 150 million Americans by prohibiting employers and unions from offering any competing health benefits. In Medicare, as seniors know it today, by eliminating Medicare Advantage plans, which are popular with seniors, and deliver higher quality health care at a better price than traditional Medicare. Medicare for All, which would be the only health care plan allowed under federal law, would only pay for treatments and services that the federal government determines are necessary or appropriate for the maintenance of health or for the diagnosis, treatment, or rehabilitation of a health condition. The result of this total government takeover of Americans' health care would place Washington bureaucrats, and not doctors and patients, completely in charge of the health care decisions of Americans. Not only will Washington decide what health care services and treatments Americans can have access to, but it will effectively decide the physicians and health care providers that you can see. Medicare for All would also authorize a government takeover of health care treatments by allowing the federal government to steal a company's intellectual property if the company and the federal government cannot come to an agreement on the price of a particular treatment. Not only would this completely do away with the constitutionally protected right to intellectual property, but would likely have a chilling effect on the innovation of new treatments and cures, as well as the associated good-paying jobs of tens of thousands at these companies, as America is the global leader in medical innovation. Under Medicare for All, what company would spend tens of millions of dollars developing the latest medical breakthrough only to see the federal government take it away? Not only would Medicare for All be bad for the health care of Americans, it would be catastrophic for the fiscal health of our nation. Our nation is already on a spending-driven path to fiscal bankruptcy. On our current budget path, CBO's June 2018 long-term budget outlook projects that spending will exceed 25% of GDP by 2034, and debt held by the public will exceed 100% of the GDP even earlier in 2031. Apart from a short-term temporary period during World War II, federal spending and publicly held debt have never reached this astronomical levels that were projected to reach on a sustained and growing basis in the near future. Medicare for All would accelerate our movement down this path. Under this plan, the federal government would foot the bill for 100% of all health care services and treatments. Beneficiaries would have zero cost sharing, meaning no deductibles, co-insurance, co-payments, or similar charges imposed on an individual for any benefits provided. By conservative estimates of a less comprehensive version of Medicare for All than the one I just discussed, and the one recently introduced in the House of Representatives, the plan would add approximately $32 trillion over 10 years to the federal budget, which is approximately $255,000 per American household on average. As humorous P.J. O'Rourke once said, if you think health care is expensive now, wait until you see what it costs when it's free. We know that our nation's long-term fiscal problems are structural and driven by the growth of mandatory spending, primarily Medicare and Medicaid. As a nation, we must find a way to get rid of, to get our health care costs under control, and not just the cost of insurance, the cost of the product, health care, in order to get off the path to national bankruptcy. However, the only thing that Medicare for All would get under control is the health care decisions of Americans, centralizing them with Washington bureaucrats in a one-size-fits-all system, and a one-size-fits-all health care system ultimately fits no one. And it doesn't work with our budget. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in front of your committee. I'm open to questions.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to clarify, the bill you're talking about was the bill that Ms. Jayapal introduced last week on Wednesday, and that $32 billion cost was not based on that legislation.
It was based on, by many people's estimates, is actually a less comprehensive version, which means her version potentially could cost even more.
We'll see about, yeah, we'll see. And just what, and you are aware that there have been a number of other proposals to expand Medicare?
Yes,
also.
right, and, early buy-ins and those things. I'm just addressing the current Medicare for All proposal, primarily the one that was introduced in the House, but others.
Good. I thank the gentleman. The ranking member has a question.
Both of the gentlemen seated at the table right now are physicians, providers. So, Dr. Bashan, just a quick question. I know you providers have studied these types of medical or these types of healthcare programs through and through. What, in your opinion, would a Medicare for All as we see it, whether it's filed in the bill that's before the Congress right now or some of the other provisions, what would a Medicare for All, a government-run, single-payer healthcare system do to the incentive for the bright young men and women of our country to enter the healthcare professions when they have a lot of other options because of their...
Well, I mean, it would dramatically change that. I mean, as you probably know, people that go into medicine tend to be entrepreneurial types, many of them, and they want to work in a system that allows them to practice medicine and have the control of the medical decision-making based on their expertise and the input from the families and the patients, and I think that would be dramatically hindered under this plan. Essentially, every medical provider in America would now be a government employee. Some estimates say that there would be a 40% or so reduction in reimbursement and income level to healthcare providers, particularly physicians, which would dramatically decrease the incentive for any young person who has a lot of options to enter the healthcare field. So I think it would dramatically decrease the incentive for people to enter healthcare.
Anyone else have a question? Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Bouchon, this is probably going to sound a little bit redundant, but I want to dig just a little bit deeper. The focus of the media has been on the Medicare for All proposals that have come out of the House and the Senate. But there are other Democrat proposals that would expand the role of government in health care through a Medicare buy-in. What are your views on how these plans will affect patients, physicians, and facilities?
Again, very similar to my answer to the ranking member. I think you're going to, first of all, from a fiscal budgetary standpoint, I just don't see, without dramatic tax increases, in our current system, if we don't get the overall cost of healthcare down, how it would put us on a sustainable path. And so, and the other thing is I think it's a stepping stone to a Medicare for All. I mean, I think many of these plans are introduced as an incremental advancement down that pathway. And so, it would again cause long-term fiscal problems with the country. It would put health care for more and more people under the control of the federal government. And my main concern as a provider is that that takes away the control of healthcare decision-making from the patient, the family, and the physician. And it would just be detrimental, in my view, to the overall sustainability of our system as a whole.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Mershon. And now I recognize Dr. Burgess from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for the recognition. Thank you for doing this Member Day. Mr. Womack, I've attended these before when you were chair and enjoyed them. I like what you've done with the place. It certainly seems to have, I guess it was included in the budget. I want to share my thoughts about the budget resolution for fiscal year 2020 and concerned about this committee's interest in pursuing single-payer government-run health care. Health policy has a budgetary component, I accept that. But on the policy side, our committee, the Committee of Energy and Commerce, is one of the principal committees of jurisdiction that involves itself deeply in the genesis and management of healthcare policy. Look, the Democrats' one-size-fits-all government-run single-payer healthcare bill would be an epic fail to provide access to quality healthcare for Americans. I hope I'll have the opportunity to answer the questions, Mr. Womack and Mr. Johnson and Mr. Roy. I'd appreciate your question as well. But this plan will lead to a massive tax increase. It will eliminate private insurance, and it will accelerate the pending bankruptcy in the already dwindling Medicare Trust Fund. The constituents in my district are struggling. They're struggling to afford their health insurance, and I am sure that my district is not the only one where people come in to me complaining about their high premiums and their high deductibles. What good is healthcare insurance if you are afraid to use it because you cannot afford your copay or your deductible? This is an issue that I would like to see us tackle, and I am confident that a government-run single-payer healthcare system would only further erode our nation's healthcare. I am the son of a physician who chose to leave Canada's government-run healthcare system behind for the United States. I worry that the central state control of healthcare as it exists in other countries would be damaging to the doctor-patient relationship. As a physician, I do not believe that the government should interfere or hinder a doctor's ability to act in the best interest of his or her patient. I wish the concept of a government dictating a physician's practice and decisions was unthinkable. However, I find myself here today having to deconstruct the idea of further government control of healthcare. A proposal by one of the members of your committee would implement a global budget. And once that is set, hospitals and institutions would be required to stick to it. You know, it sounds like a block grant. Maybe that's a good thing. But there's another part of the bill that talks about making this expenditure an entitlement. So I'm a little confused. Is it a block grant or is it an entitlement? And as this committee knows better than any committee in the United States House of Representatives, the thing that is driving our debt and deficit is that expenditure which is already baked into the cake over which we have no control. It is that 67% of the budget that is on autopilot, that's on automatic spending. Today, we should be focusing on parts of the health insurance market that are working for Americans. According to a survey from America's Health Insurance Plans, over 70% of Americans are satisfied with employer-sponsored health insurance. And it provides robust protections for individuals. And guess what? There's no prohibition on covering, or there is a prohibition on failing to cover pre-existing conditions. And that's not the Affordable Care Act, that's the ERISA law. That's Senator Javits' legislation from 1973. Quite simply, the success of the employer-sponsored insurance market is not worth wiping out with single-payer health care. Since President Trump took office, the number of Americans having employer-sponsored health insurance is between 2.5 and 5 million more than it was just a little over 2 years ago. That's more than at any time since 2000. Democrats want to abolish that type of insurance entirely. Look, I was the senior policy advisor, health policy advisor for Senator McCain's presidential campaign. Senator McCain proposed a plan that would impact ERISA plans, and I learned firsthand That's not something that you want to mess with. People don't take kindly to you changing their employer-sponsored health insurance. So instead of it building on the success of our existing health insurance framework, this radical single-payer government-run system would tear it down. It would eliminate employer-sponsored health insurance, private health insurance, and popular Medicare Advantage plans. The single-payer healthcare system would be another failed attempt at one-size-fits-all. Americans are all different, and a single-payer healthcare system will not meet the varying needs of each and every individual. Single-payer is not one-size-fits-all. It's one-size-fits-no one. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Does any member have a question of the witness? The ranking member.
Dr. Burgess, the same question I ask of Dr. Bucshon, and that is, what in your opinion are the second and third order effects of a Medicare for all in whatever form and the provider community?
So how much time do you have? Look, people don't hazard big things for no gain. It is true that some of us who went into medicine went in for the most altruistic of reasons. We wanted to help our fellow man. It really wasn't a concept of earning a good living in that profession. It's because it was what I was almost if it was in my DNA, is what I was born to do. I'm the son of a physician. My grandfather was a physician. That's what I was destined to become. However, as we've seen today, I mean, it costs a lot of money to go to medical school. I mean, our students are finishing medical school in their residency with crushing amounts of debt. You can't expect them to take on that kind of liability, which basically will subjugate them the rest of their lives if you're not willing to pay the freight on the other end, on the compensation side. And as we heard from Dr. Bucshon, the expectation is that in a single-payer government-run system where there is no, you just take, you become a price taker. You take what they're spending. And also, I think the bigger question is, what would you do to actually make things better? And this is what I never understood. And of course, I wasn't involved when the Affordable Care Act was written. I wasn't invited into those closed-door sessions. But when you look at the success of the employer-sponsored health insurance in this country, and again, over 70% now covered with employer-sponsored health insurance, the favorability rate is off the charts high, and you will find that out when you go to take it away from people because they'll be mighty upset. Why did we not look at expanding the availability of that type of insurance? In the individual market, it's an entirely different situation. And so for those individuals in the individual market, yeah, they do have exclusions for pre-existing conditions. There are things where the insurance companies have made some rules that are perhaps not consistent with good health and benefits. However, this House, or the House under Republicans, almost every year that I've been in service here, has passed a bill that dealt with association health plans. Association health plans would allow small group markets and individual markets to buy into, to pool together and buy into those large group markets with ERISA protections against exclusions for pre-existing conditions that have been in existence since 1973. Why wouldn't we have done that rather than what was done? And the answer to that question is, do you want the individual or the individual in concert with their employer to be in charge of their health care, or do you want the government to be in charge? And if the answer is you want the government to be in charge, then no, you don't care anything about employer-sponsored health insurance, and you're willing to take it away from people, even at some political hazard and peril, and I guarantee you there's political hazard and peril if you go down that road. But why wouldn't you provide something that people actually like and what people actually want? The big fail of the Affordable Care Act is that you provide a subsidy and a mandate, and you've destroyed, of course, the market. Why would an insurance company sell me something that I actually wanted to buy when I've got to buy what they're selling under penalty of law, or I'm going to get a big fine? That's what is so baffling about the system that we find ourselves with today, and we're going to make it worse.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Johnson.
Dr. Burgess, you're not very passionate about these things, are you?
Well, I think about it from time to time, but otherwise, I'm just worried about how we broke the internet. It doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your passion. Our Republican ranking member Republican leader asked the question about how it will affect, how Medicare for All will affect the provider community, and you're a member of that provider community. What happens to the patient? I mean, if we see what many are projecting could be as much as a 40% decrease in payments to providers under a Medicare for All scheme, which will not cover the costs of operating their practices, what is that going to mean for the millions of Americans that call themselves patients?
Well, let me take this in two parts. First off, just the effect on the practice of medicine. I thought it would take longer for the deleterious effects of the Affordable Care Act to affect my profession. It was astonishingly fast. And I don't know whether it was by design or was a defect in the Affordable Care Act, the facilitation of consolidation in the healthcare marketplace. Doctors purchasing medical practices really has taken off. I get it why a doctor would enter that type of relationship. It's just too darn much trouble. I'm having to, spend all my energy trying to take care of sick people, and I don't have time to deal with the insurance companies and every other aspect. The hospital wants to buy my practice at a tidy sum. I'll sell it to them and I'll just work for them. But here's the problem with that. Our contract's always with the patient. It's not with the hospital, it's not with the government. No man can serve two masters. As a physician, my contract must be with the patient. I must always keep the patient's best interest at the front of my mind, because if I don't, if I'm only worried about what it's going to cost the hospital or how can I make more money for the hospital, perhaps with some additional tests that can be ordered, drives the cost of the whole system upward. It's not in the best interest of the patient to have the doctor working for anyone but the patient. And that's one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind.
This is a little bit anecdotal, and I know that's dangerous in a hearing to go.
Plural of anecdote is data.
Anecdotal. But, I mean, life expectancy in the United States has tremendously increased over the last 4 or 5 decades. We talk about Medicare and Social Security, and when those programs were put in place, people were living into their 60s. Now people are living into their 80s, 90s, and I got people in my district that are popping 100. There's something working in America's healthcare system, that Americans are living longer because of improved health outcomes. Why do we want to tear that down?
I don't have an answer for you because it doesn't seem wise. I did hear Mr. McGovern made the statement that life expectancy was decreasing. There's no question, and you know this, the opiate epidemic has in fact had an impact on life expectancy in this country. But the general thesis that you're putting forward is absolutely correct. And, we just had that hearing on vaccines in our committee. We forget the number of children we used to lose to vaccine-preventable injury just a few short years ago. And those lives are not lost today. Not this Congress, but the United States House of Representatives passed a big bill right at the end of 2016, right at the end of the Obama administration. It was signed into law by President Obama. I think it was one of his last bills, called Cures for the 21st Century. We worked on that in our committee for several years. Mm-hmm. And you think about the number of big breakthroughs that are just tantalizingly close, and Cures was to bring them even closer and deliver them to patients so they can begin making an impact in their lives. I look at that through a provider's eyes and say, this generation of doctors that's coming up, they're going to have tools at their disposal to alleviate human suffering that no generation of doctors has ever known. That's the good news. And we, the United States of America, the United States House of Representatives, is making that investment and bringing those things ever closer. And that's a good thing, and we should all celebrate that. We're going to have to figure out on some of the cost parameters, as we saw with the breakthrough drug that cured hepatitis C. Boy, it nearly bankrupted some state Medicaid programs. They weren't expecting that. So we're going to have to better communicate those things that are just around the corner. But it's going to be it will be a true golden age of medicine.
All right, thank you. I
Apologize
yield
for going
back.
long.
Gentleman's time has expired. I just want to correct one little comment that you made, and it was related to the Affordable Care Act when you said you were not invited into the room. You may not have been specifically, but to create the impression that that was a closed process is,
Yeah.
there were dozens and dozens of hearings on both the House and Senate. There were markups. I was on the Ways and Means Committee at the time. We had a meeting with all 45 members, Republicans and Democrats. We asked Republicans, is there any way we can write a health care reform bill that any one of you can support? They said no. They didn't want to participate in the process. That was the reaction we got consistently. Republicans were consistently invited into the process and refused to participate. So
I can't, just if I may, I can't speak for the Ways and Means Committee. Yes, the Energy and Commerce Committee did have a several-day markup, and Chairman Waxman did entertain a number of Republican amendments. But as you'll recall how that all played out, it was a bill that passed on the Senate floor on Christmas Eve that was delivered back to the House, and all of the work that the House had done the year before going into that, good or bad, was then done away with, and we just had to take or leave. It was the Senate bill, take it or leave it. And I remember Speaker Pelosi's comments when that bill came over from the Senate. Well, I haven't got 100 votes for this damn thing over here, and she didn't until they worked on people and eventually got it passed, and it was a strict party line vote.
right. Well, we'll have plenty of opportunity in the Congress to debate the future of health care. We need to move ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would
Yes,
like
Mr.
to
Roy.
address my colleague from Texas, if I might. Thank you. Wanted just a couple quick questions for you, Doctor. Thank you first for dedicating your life to the care of others and to healthcare, and obviously serving here. Thank you for your time here today. I would note I was not in Congress in 2009. I think my observation as a spectator, as a federal prosecutor back in Texas, and just watching public policy from Texas, was that clearly that was passed on a strict party line vote, that it was put through in a process that was questionable at best, and that Obamacare, which you would think when it was passed and implemented, to pretty much, start the slow decline of destroying our healthcare system, the private healthcare market, would in fact been something that we tried to be done on a bipartisan basis, not a partisan basis. Am I missing anything in my assessment of how that was passed in 2009?
Well, and fortunately for you, we have a good example of healthcare policy that did proceed on an open and bipartisan basis, and that was the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015. Got rid of the sustainable growth rate formula, something I'd fought for all the time that I'd been here. And it got 393 votes in the House and 92 votes in the Senate, so it had significant broad bipartisan support. And the important thing there is, and we know this, when we do big, especially healthcare policy bills, but in other areas of policy, we do big stuff like that, it gets over to the agency, and they start interpreting it, and if it's really big and vast, sometimes they interpret it in ways that, oh my gosh, where the heck did that come from? And I have seen this personally with the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act. You'll hear doctors complain about MACRA and MIPS back home, and to be sure, it requires constant vigilance on the part of the committee. We've had 4 oversight hearings on MACRA, and there has been bipartisan input in trying to fix the problems as they have arisen. So if you do something in a bipartisan fashion, you have more equity with which to work going forward when the inevitable problems of implementation, when those occur.
So a couple other quick questions. We've talked a lot about the costs since we're here in the Budget Committee of something like Medicare for All. We're aware there are a lot of reports out there. $32 trillion is at least one assessment. I've seen $40 trillion. Are you aware that even Senator Sanders, who puts out his full support for Medicare for All and was one of the original proponents of it, that even on his own website he would suggest that it costs $1.38 trillion per year over 10 years. In other words, $14 trillion. So even his own promotion of it would be another $14 trillion, i.e. more than our annual deficit right now. Would you agree that that's the bottom line assessment of the cost, but the actual cost is more along the lines of Mercatus' report or others at $32 or $40 trillion?
We historically underestimate the costs of these programs.
No way, in Washington, D.C. And then the question, we're talking about private markets and healthcare, would you agree that the purpose of government is to protect the inalienable rights and protect our liberty, that that's the reason our government exists? And are we aware that under Medicare for All, that we're pretty much going to outlaw private insurance? That's the purpose of it, is essentially to outlaw it and leave it at best at the margins as an additive.
So if the question is the government too big, too small, or just the right size, I think you and I would agree that it's too big. And you would do nothing towards right-sizing that government if you were to add to it the part of the GDP that is composed of healthcare in this country. It will inexorably rise and rise to a level that I think is almost incomprehensible, but it will, we talked about banks that were too big to fail.
Right.
We've got an agency over there that's too big to work.
Right.
This should be devolved to the states. We should look at ways to help our states put together the programs and let it work on a more local level rather than all over at the Hubert Humphrey Building or some place up in Bethesda.
And finally, would you agree that, and I've had a number of people talk about, quote, the wild, wild west of healthcare prior to Obamacare. Would you agree that in 2008, prior to the implementation of Obamacare, that we had an overwhelmingly regulated healthcare market from UMRA and HIPAA and EMTALA and all of the additional regulations that have been put on place from Washington, D.C., such that you didn't have a functioning market to drive costs down in 2008, and that has been made inexorably worse by Obamacare, and so that anything going towards Medicare for All will make it even further more regulated and increase costs to the taxpayers? And that's my last question. Thank you, Doctor.
Throughout my professional political lifetime, healthcare has been one of the most intensely regulated aspects of any type of business in this country.
All right, the gentleman's time has expired. Anyone else? Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Montgomery, for 5 minutes.
And I want to thank you and Ranking Member Womack and other members of this committee for holding today's hearing and extending the opportunity for members to testify on our legislative priorities and things that we think are important. As many of you know, I've spent a great deal of my time in Congress focused on the issue of hunger, nutrition, and food insecurity. And my priorities this year will come as little surprise. Today I'm here to advocate for federal nutrition programs that help our most vulnerable constituents, and to highlight why these programs continue to need our unwavering protection and attention as this committee works to craft a budget resolution for fiscal year 2020. I'll start by highlighting why nutrition programs are important. There's a need in this country. We live in the richest country in the history of the world, and we have tens of millions of people who are food insecure or hungry. As members of Congress, we should be ashamed of that. We should be demanding that reality change. In 2018, a monthly average of 40.3 million people participated in the SNAP program. That's 1 in 8 Americans. More than 68% are families with children. 33% are the elderly or have disabilities. And over 1.3 million are veterans. The average participant is provided with a modest benefit. I also serve on the Agriculture Committee, and I asked some of my colleagues, does anyone know what the average SNAP benefit is? And I had answers ranging from enough to adequate to generous. Well, the reality is the average SNAP benefit is $1.40 per person per meal. You can't even buy a cup of coffee for that, but that's what it is. SNAP stands, you all know SNAP stands for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. In most homes, SNAP assistance only covers a fraction of a low-income family's food budget. And the average time that families participate in SNAP, contrary to what some have suggested, is less than a year. Since the President assumed power in 2017, nutrition programs have been under constant attack. These attacks are often framed as cost savings and ultimately create more problems than they solve. On December 20th of 2018, the Trump administration proposed a rule that was specifically rejected for inclusion in the Farm Bill reauthorization bill that was passed in a bipartisan way and was signed into law last year. The rule that the administration proposes threatens the eligibility of SNAP participants who are considered able-bodied adults without dependents. They call it ABODs. In an effort to, ironically, quote, restore self-sufficiency through the dignity of work, end of quote, the rule stigmatizes SNAP participants and limits a state's ability to waive 20-hour work requirements. Now, ABODs are a very complex group. Many of them are veterans, returning veterans, who are having difficulty reintegrating into our communities after serving in war situations. Many of them are young adults who have aged out of foster care. Some of them are ex-felons who are products of mass incarceration. And some of them are workers who aren't given 20 hours of work per week, or they live in areas where there's no jobs or they can't get access to a job training program. 75% of SNAP participants do work. They do work, but often they work in jobs that are either unstable or they don't pay enough to prevent food insecurity. So it's not that that ABODs are jobless by choice. Many are jobless because they lack privilege and are trying to get on their feet. As if the proposed rule wasn't enough, the administration also appears to be manipulating the Republican majority in the Senate to starve the American citizens of Puerto Rico. By refusing to take up the supplemental appropriations bill we sent them during the shutdown in January, Leader McConnell, unfortunately, is failing to provide disaster relief funding for Puerto Rico's nutrition assistance program. In the coming months, the Trump administration also announced their intention to propose changes to categorical eligibility. Categorical eligibility, or CAT-L, was actually a Republican idea. It is criteria used to determine whether a family is automatically eligible for SNAP because they already qualify for certain other low-income programs. CAT-L is fine as it is because it eliminates redundancy and it minimizes hurdles that low-income families must overcome just to keep up with their basic needs. While the President has yet to announce forthcoming changes, given the tone of recent attacks, I don't have a lot of optimism. So, look, last week in a House Agriculture meeting, I asked Secretary Perdue for specific data that was used to justify some of these new proposed rules changes. I'm still looking forward to their response because in all my years I've never seen the data provided that would justify some of the changes that they are making. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, there are those who assert that SNAP and other social safety net programs are too expensive to maintain. I would say that tolerating hunger and food insecurity in this country is too expensive. Kids who go to school hungry don't learn. Workers who are food insecure are less productive in the workplace. There is a link between food insecurity and health care costs. We just heard this conversation about health care. One of the big driving elements in terms of high costs in health care is food insecurity and lack of access to good nutrition. I think that we need to figure out a way to not only protect these programs, but also have a discussion on how we strengthen our social safety net. So that is why this year and for the rest of the 116th Congress, I request your assistance in both prioritizing funding for nutrition assistance programs and using this and using committee instructions to stop any effort by this administration or anybody else to undo the work that that Congress has done in the Farm Bill. We bear responsibility in working to end hunger, and I will continue to advocate fiercely for our most vulnerable communities. And I thank you all for your attention and all your patience, because you're going to be hearing from a lot of members today. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any questions for the witness? Hearing none, thank you once again. I now recognize the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Holland.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Members of the committee, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to share New Mexico's key priorities in the fiscal year 2020 federal budget. It's a great honor to speak before you today, and I appreciate the hard work your committee does. Mr. Chairman, my district encompasses Albuquerque and surrounding areas, is blessed with natural beauty, over 300 days of sunshine every year, and abundant wind resources that can drive a vibrant renewable energy economy that will create thousands of jobs in my district and millions nationwide. It would also reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which is extremely important to fight climate change. I urge the committee to develop a budget that robustly supports our commitment to efficient renewable energy and investments in job training for a green economy.
I encourage you to include sufficient funding to increase the maximum Pell Grant, provide universal pre-K, improve teacher effectiveness, support low-performing schools, and focus on proven methods to improve student achievement. As chairwoman of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, I recognize the role of the federal government in preserving our natural places for future generations. Our budget should fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund to maximize habitat protection, public access, public recreation, and historic preservation. My district is home to many rural communities. The budget should live up to the promises our nation has made to them. I urge you to fully fund the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program and the Secure Rural Schools program and allow for a permanent SRS solution that will ensure forest counties receive stable long-term payments. I take my role on the House Armed Services Committee very seriously. Last month, military families living in privatized housing in Albuquerque shared troubling news. We have a military housing crisis on our hands, not just in my district, but nationwide, and we need to fix it. That's why I am asking for this committee to adequately fund the Family Housing Improvement Fund and the Family Housing Operation and Maintenance Fund to provide quality housing for military families. My state is home to the national labs and military bases that are vital to our national security, including Sandia National Labs and Kirtland Air Force Base, which are both in my district. I urge you to provide funding to allow work to expand Sandia and Kirtland to increase our national security and develop innovative technologies to address the many challenges we face, including climate change, through the Departments of Defense and Energy. The Air Force must have the resources it needs to clean up the fuel spill at Kirtland and PFAS contaminants in the areas surrounding bases in New Mexico and nationwide. It's a safety and public hazard, and it's also wreaking havoc economically on citizens who live near these spills. It's threatening New Mexicans and similarly situated Americans around the country. As one of the first 2 Native American women elected to Congress and co-chair of the Native American Caucus, I urge you to address the serious problems Indian tribes face. Today, Native Americans face unique challenges and harsh living conditions resulting from the many years of federal government's forced removal of tribes to reservation lands and their assimilation to urban areas. Many residing in Indian country still lack access to clean drinking water, to adequate law enforcement, indoor plumbing, electricity, structurally sound buildings, and drivable roads. The government-to-government relationship between tribal nations with the United States is based on commitments made by the federal government in exchange for the surrender and reduction of their homelands. That is called the Federal Trust Responsibility to Tribes. Congress's failure to adequately fund Indian country is a fundamental violation of this trust responsibility and basic civil rights of Native Americans. I urge you to develop a budget in which equitable and non-discretionary federal funding is made available directly to tribes and increased to remedy the many decades of underfunding. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Chairman, it is essential that we have a successful 2020 census to ensure both proper representation in this body and the proper distribution of federal funding and resources to all of our communities. A budget is a statement of priorities. It's our priority to invest in education, healthcare, innovation, and competitiveness. We must reaffirm those commitments in the fiscal year 2020 budget resolution, and I thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. Are there any questions for her? Thank you very much. It's now my privilege to introduce the Majority Leader of the House, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Is this on? Now it's on. Thank you very much for allowing me to spend some time with you. The budget process is broken. That's not good for the Congress. It's not good for the American people. I testified before Mr. Womack's committee that tried to bring some rationality to our process and effectiveness to our process. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed. We made some progress, didn't succeed. You have heard and will be hearing from a lot of members today about priorities affecting individual districts. I, however, want to speak to you about what ought to be an overarching budget priority for our country. Those of you who have heard me testify here in the past know that I have consistently advocated for making the difficult decisions necessary, not only to stop adding to the deficit, but to reverse the long-term fiscal trends that threaten our future economic prosperity. Over the next several weeks, this committee has an opportunity to start off the budget process for 2020 on the right foot and allow appropriators to get to work on funding government on time. One of the most important functions of the budget resolution, of course, is to set the 302A allocation, giving the Appropriations Committee a top-line budget for all 12 of its funding bills. That process has been somewhat hijacked in recent years by statutory spending caps for defense and non-defense appropriations put in place by the Budget Control Act in 2011. With frequent delays in the appropriation process as we negotiate deals to adjust the caps to meet our national needs. The bottom line is the majority of the Congress does not believe we can live within the sequester caps. That's why we have repeatedly made two-year deals to suspend those caps. I believe it is critical that we achieve a bipartisan agreement on how to replace sequester-level spending caps for both defense and non-defense appropriations for the coming fiscal year as soon as possible. It seems to me that no members more than the Budget Committee would want to see that done. Essentially, the sequester substitutes itself for the rational judgments of the Budget Committee based upon the information that you receive. It would be not only deeply unfortunate, in my view, if we missed an opportunity to do the job we were sent here to do, but it would increase the chance that our country could be headed for another disastrous government shutdown. This committee can and should set the tone for that agreement as you consider the budget resolution and the appropriations 302A. If done quickly, a new BCA caps deal can accelerate the work of passing appropriation bills on time, conferencing them with the Senate, not just 4 people, all of the members of the Appropriations Committee and the Congress, and the President signing them into law. No more shutdowns, missed paychecks, or endless continuing resolutions leading to economic uncertainty for our markets and financial insecurity for our people. CRs are evidence of failure. Necessary, but evidence of failure. I was disappointed to learn that the Trump administration intends to send us a budget next week that rejects the existing bipartisan consensus enshrined in the last 3 BCA caps. Mr. Ryan and Ms. Murray were part of that process by using the so-called overseas contingency accounts. That is a fraud. It means we will not pay the bill. It means my children and grandchildren will pay the bill for the defense and security that we want to buy today. That account is used as a backdoor by exempting nearly $200 billion in additional defense spending from its BCA cap while slashing non-defense spending well below the sequester level in the name of fiscal austerity. The debt and deficits that we incur are not labeled defense and non-defense, nor even are they labeled entitlements. They're just the deficit that all of our kids are going to have to pay. I'm not going to be paying it, but our kids are going to pay it. That is either gross malpractice, which does a disservice to the budget process and virtually assures another budget standoff, i.e. failure of the Congress to do its job. at the end of the year, or a dangerous shortchanging of our military's capacity to exchange in long-term national security planning. Because, of course, the sequester says if we have not passed a legislative amendment to sequester, 15 days after we adjourn this session of the Congress of the United States, we will slash defense and non-defense alike. Irrationally, some magic process that we thought was going to contain the deficit. In fact, the deficit has exploded. In my view, in large part because of the tax bill. I know we have differences on that, but we will see whether or not that tax bill pays for itself. I'm convinced it will not. This committee has the best platform, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Womack, best platform to reject such an approach and work towards consensus on a budget that reflects adjusting the BCA caps. And I will tell you, I have talked to the leaders of the Senate, Republican and Democrat. They all believe we ought to come to a budget cap agreement. Obviously, that involves the administration. To accommodate our priorities on both the defense and non-defense sides of the ledger, while maintaining the principle of parity. I urge the committee to serve as an example to the rest of us on how to work together with the precedent of the three prior BCA cap agreements as your guide. Again, Chairman Ryan got one of them. As a matter of fact, he was involved in two of them. To reject the kind of budget gimmickry and fiscal brinksmanship that led to the longest shutdown in our nation's history. I want to thank Chairman and the Ranking Member, both of whom were good friends of mine, and both sides of the aisle. We only have one side of the aisle plus the chairman here. It's a shame. And I'm not talking about anything in my district or anything. I've got a lot of priorities, just like all of you do. But, gentlemen, there are no ladies here, but to the ladies on the staff, we have a responsibility to future generations. And we all talk about balancing the budget. We all talk about fiscal responsibility, and none of us practice it. I am very upset that the administration, Mr. Mulvaney, who, by the way, as a member of Congress, not only voted to shut down the government, but voted to keep it shut down. We are not following fiscally prudent practices that will benefit future generations and the strength of our country. If you talk to all the 4 stars on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they'll say one of the biggest security threats confronting our country is the debt and deficit. And they are worried operational, personnel costs, of course, but operations and deployments and acquisitions are all going to be adversely affected if we don't get a handle on this budget deficit. And the first step is getting to an agreement on the caps so that you can then pass legislation within the context of those caps, which will give us a roadmap onto how we ought to fund our government. I've gone 3 minutes and 58 minutes over time. I apologize for that, but ladies and gentlemen, we need to lead on this issue, and we need to urge the administration not to play games with the budget cap, not to try to use it as a leverage, but we ought to get to that and get about the appropriation process. I have reserved all of June to pass every appropriation bill by June 30th. I've told all the authorizing committees, we're going to pass appropriation bills. I'm not going to put any other bill if it undermines that objective, so that we can give the Senate time to do it and we can do our work by September 30th. There's no reason we can't do it except for political gamesmanship and procrastination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the Majority Leader. Ranking Member.
I thank the gentleman, distinguished leader, for his comments, and a lot of which I agree with. And we may disagree on some things. They would be minor in comparison to the bigger issues facing our country right now. The leader referenced the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform, and just for the record, you're looking at 2 people who voted for the limited amount of work that the Joint Select Committee was able to do, it was a baby step, but a step nonetheless toward regular order that the gentleman references. So I do appreciate the fact that he recognizes that budget process reform has to be a long-term goal of the Congress, because we're not being served very well right now by the process that we are currently going through. I would ask the gentleman this question, and that is to give us, from his perspective as the majority leader, kind of a vision, short-term vision into the rest of this year as we approach October 1st, because there are a couple of hurdles in this process that could indeed force differing viewpoints to end up with a shutdown that none of us would like. But we got a debt ceiling issue in the month, in this month, but with extraordinary measures can be put off indefinitely, or at least for a certain amount of time. And then we have the caps deal that he has referenced. So when we get to the point of marking up appropriations bills, to what levels are we going to be looking at in this regard?
Congressman, there are, first of all, let me speak to the debt limit. I think the debt limit is a totally phony issue. Absolutely dead, flat, phony. I think it is a political issue only. The way I explain it to my constituents is you go into Macy's and you buy $200 worth of goods, you give them your credit card, and you take the goods home. And you're sitting around the kitchen table a week later and you say, boy, we're in debt too far. So husband and wife agree, well, we're going to have a debt limit, $100. Macy's sends you a bill for $200, and you send them a $100 check back and with a letter and say, we have a debt limit of $100, and so we can't pay the rest of the money. So Macy's says, writes you back, says, we're very sorry, but we're going to sue you. That's what the debt limit is. Every time we appropriate money, we affect the debt limit. Every time we pass a tax bill, we affect the debt limit. Every time we authorize money to be spent, and it is then spent, we affect the debt limit. That's when the debt limit decisions are made when you decide to spend money for whatever object you do. The debt limit's a phony political issue that we get wrapped around the axle, and if we ever fail to extend the debt limit to accommodate what America owes its own employees, its operational costs, or frankly, foreign creditors or domestic creditors for that matter, we will have defaulted, and the global economy will be adversely affected. Every administration says that's not a viable option. I've told Secretary Mnuchin that I am for a clean debt limit extension, and I will vote for it and urge my members to vote for it. And we play political games with one another. We have a Republican president. We weren't. We played games with a debt limit, and vice versa. If we had a Democratic president, Republicans played games with it. We ought not to do that. So from the debt limit standpoint, I think it ought not to be used, as I think this administration is contemplating using it, as a leverage. It was used as a leverage in 2013 as well, January 2013, and very frankly had an impact on the sequester, none of which I think were good policies. On the budget caps, my contention is, and I've been working this for 2 months now, 2.5 months. John and I talked at the very beginning of the year. Steve, I think I talked to you as well, that we need to get the budget caps. Now, we can proceed with the appropriations process in a timely fashion by deeming the numbers. But the problem with deeming the numbers, let's say we agree with the Senate on the deeming numbers, let's say we pass bills on the deeming numbers, and let's say we send them down to the president. If the president doesn't agree and he vetoes them, we can't pass them, then the bills are not going into effect. But even if he passes, even if he signs the bills, unless we amend the BCA, the sequester will take effect 15 years, would that the case, 15 days after we adjourn this session of the Congress of the United States, which would be a very substantial cut in both military and defense. Now, the administration has suggested we use OCO, $200 billion worth of OCO. Free money. Doesn't count. It goes on somebody's tab, and somebody's going to have to pay it sometime. I think that is not honest budgeting, not only for this generation, but for generations to come. And I think we ought to get over that. So I'm urging that we adopt the BHCA as quickly as we can. And if the president doesn't agree, we ought to send legislation down there, an agreement between the Senate and the House of what those numbers ought to be. The 302A is essentially what the BCA deals with, for both domestic and defense and non-defense domestic discretionary spending. That would be my hope. That's what I'm working towards. I'm not encouraged by the White House's position.
Thank the Majority Leader for his time. Oh, I'm sorry. Roy? Oh.
Well, my colleague from Texas.
Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Leader, thank you for being here, and I am pleased to say that there are several areas where I agree with you. One is I agree that debts and the deficit are harmful to future generations of America. I also agree that the sequester harms our national security and makes it less safe for American families. I applaud your move to get all the appropriations bills done by June the 30th, and I'm hopeful that you'll be successful in that regard. I also agree that we need a cap steel. So my question is what do you think the cap steel looks like? I know that you said it has to be everybody, all Senate and all House. I agree with that. I just wonder what your thought is. If you could design.
It needs to be everybody, but it needs to be at least 60 in the Senate and 218 on our side, or whatever many people are voting. What I think it would look like is something like Brian Murray. I mean, it's going to be a deal as to how much we think we can afford and or spend on defense and how much we need or can afford on domestic. And that's a somewhat subjective judgment, obviously. There's no magic figure out there. It's a subjective judgment. My view would be, obviously, we control the House now. That's a difference in the political. So it will not be surprising that we will ask for a number closer to defense than we had last time. But I don't think there's any magic number. And frankly, I think getting to a number that allows for inflation on both sides is something that I would urge. Obviously, on defense, the administration talked about three numbers essentially. I think we have 716 this year. They've talked about 733, and they've talked about 750. I don't know what that where they really are. But they haven't talked about it. They've talked about sequester for the non-defense plus a percentage. I don't know that we would agree to that, but surely we ought to be able to come to agreement, given the fact that we control the House, you guys control the Senate, and you control the presidency. So there has to be an agreement. Or we're going to be in a position where we have gridlock again and the possibility of either sequester taking place or shutting down the government, or both.
The continuing, when you look at the components of the federal budget, discretionary, I'm going to compare it to the last time your party was in power to this time. The discretionary spending is down just a little over 1% from where it was in fiscal 10. The interest on debt is up 94%, mandatory spending is up 33.5%, and revenues are up 62.5%. So that would suggest that revenues are not necessarily the issue, but then we've got this big hairy line in the budget called mandatory spending that presents the challenge. If we both agree that debt and deficits are bad, what should we do in terms of looking at that section of the budget that has shown the greatest growth?
Hold hands.
And jump?
No. If you do not hold hands, neither party will do it.
Right.
Because they're tough decisions that have to be made.
Right.
And the other party, whoever the other party is, will demagogue the other if you try to take decisions alone. The reason Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were able to do something which funded Social Security and made it stable for a lot of years was because they held hands. They did it together, and they said, this has got to be done.
Are y'all willing to do that in this Congress?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, honestly. But you asked me what my view was of how you do that. You will not get a handle on meeting the needs both of national security and of domestic security without really fiscal confrontations unless we agree together and unless Mr. Yarmouth and Mr. Womack and the committee get together and say, look, this is what we ought to do for our country.
Okay.
This is what's responsible.
I appreciate the comment. I agree with you. We're going to have to hold hands and not demagogue each other as we tackle these thorny issues.
Right.
Because as we said, one area I agree is that debt deficits are bad for the future of our American families. I would note for the record that in terms of interest in this conversation today, that there are 3 times as many Republicans here as Democrats. So I yield back.
Maybe that's a comment on me.
Mr. Roy is recognized. And I will remind the members, we have 10 witnesses left. And if we take this much time with all 10 of them, we will be here until well past votes. I just want to remind.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
may I,
sir. Yes, the ranking
I'd
member is
like to move that because of the time and because of the number of witnesses left, I know I would be willing to agree to limit the Q&A following any of the remaining speakers to include this particular witness to a couple of minutes, if that would be in order.
I certainly would respect that. Okay, without objection, so ordered. Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Leader. Thank you for your time for joining us here today. A couple of quick questions. As a freshman coming into this process, I don't bring with it the experience or the baggage of having gone through the CAPS process or the previous year's debates. But I did want to just kind of understand some of the facts. If I understand correctly, you know, in the last year, we busted the caps, so to speak, to use that phrase that we use around here, by $153 billion, of which about 80-odd billion, 85 billion, I think, was defense, and 60-odd billion was non-defense discretionary and busting the caps. Does that sound right to you in terms of how much we busted the caps last year?
Yes.
And so I guess my question is
I don't know precisely, but
ballparking.
Ballpark.
Yes, sir. If my question is when we're talking about the sequesters kicking in, right? Law this year means they will kick in again, as you pointed out. How much will we have as a deficit this year, even if we allow the sequesters to kick in? Do you know that number?
I do not know the specific number. It's over $1 trillion.
Yeah. I mean, basically, we'll be spending $1 trillion more than we take in, even if we allow sequesters to kick in. But what I hear from both sides of the aisle, let me be 100% clear here, nonpartisan observation and critique as a freshman coming in, is that I don't see or hear any plan whatsoever on what to do about that particular problem. In other words, we're talking about, all I'm hearing is that we need to bust the caps even further in order to have non-defense discretionary go up and defense go up. So hawks get what they want in terms of spending increases. Those who want to see non-defense discretionary go up, have that go up, just as we did last year with a chart that I've used in the Budget Committee before with these big red lines really busting the caps so that the American people sit out, to use your analogy about how people balance their budgets at home. How do, nobody at home says, well, God, gee, I really want a brand new loaded Suburban, so I'm just going to bust my budgetary caps this year by 25%. Like, who does that? And I'm just trying to figure out what on earth we're going to ever do to solve this problem.
If you look at the amount of consumer debt, you may reflect upon that answer.
Well, I understand that.
Gentlemen,
They still have to pay their interest. They still have to pay their monthly payments, and at least those who are following the law.
Gentlemen's time has expired. We're going to try to move this along. Does anyone else have any questions? Thank you. I thank the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much.
The order as I have it, for those who are here,
By the way, I really like the way you've done your room. I told Mr. Womack.
actually, I give Mr. Womack credit for that.
We did it before we handed it over to the Democrats.
Thank you very much on both counts.
Thank you. See, is Mr. Klein here? Yes. Okay, so the order that I have here is Mr. Klein, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and Ms. Slotkin. Oh, Ms. Houlihan's here. Mr. McAdams. Mr. McAdams was sitting here, so let me recognize him now. Mr. McAdams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Womack and members of the Budget Committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. Before I was elected to Congress, I was a mayor who had to balance a budget every year in a bipartisan fashion. And I was then, as I am now, accountable to taxpayers for every dollar spent, and nothing was more important to me than to be a good steward of the hard-earned tax dollars that we received. I believe that our $22 trillion debt is a bipartisan problem. Both parties are responsible for getting us into this mess. In 2017, we saw Republicans in the House jam through an irresponsible tax cut for the wealthy and the well-connected that added almost $2 trillion to our national debt total. They sold that tax to the public by saying in part that it would pay for itself, but most economists say that that is a myth. That additional $2 trillion simply piled onto the enormous economic burden we've created for future generations rather than achieve needed tax reform. Both Democrats and Republicans have acted in a way that suggests that the debt doesn't matter, but I'm here to say that I believe the debt does matter. Unfortunately, the interest on our national debt is now the fastest growing part of the federal budget. Next year, we will spend more on interest than all the federal funding for our kids. And by the year 2025, 6 years from now, our interest payments will exceed the cost of our defense budget. Growing interest payments will crowd out other investments that would move our country forward, such as education or housing or infrastructure. And not only is that fiscally irresponsible, I believe it's morally reprehensible to saddle generations yet unborn with those bills. And someday, those bills will come due. As has been said before, but still holds true today, the first rule when you find yourself in a deep hole is to stop digging. And that's why I was so critical in our first votes in the House on the rules package that we kept pay-as-you-go requirements. Every Utah family understands that when you decide to make a purchase, you must first show how you'll pay for it. Either you find additional revenue or you cut back on spending elsewhere so that you continue to live within your budget. When I was mayor, I consistently faced trade-offs. But you set your priorities and you make choices, and sometimes those are very difficult choices. Again, this is what hardworking Utah families in my district do every day when they sit at the kitchen table and balance their checkbooks, and Congress must do the same. As one of the co-chairs of the Blue Dog Task Force on Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform, I'll be working with my colleagues and my fellow co-chair, Representative Ed Case, to pursue smart, strategic policies to rein in the federal government's persistent annual deficits and unsustainable debt. We will be responsible for crafting policies that increase transparency, hold Congress accountable to the taxpayers, and ensure that money is wisely spent. Another tool in our toolbox, I believe, must be a balanced budget amendment, and I hope to introduce legislation on this soon. The Blue Dog Coalition has championed this issue in the past, and I will work with members to advance this issue again in Congress. By generally prohibiting the federal government from spending more than it receives in a fiscal year, I think we can start to turn the Titanic of debt around. Lawmakers in both parties must take a hard look at both the revenue and the spending side of the ledger, while also protecting the Social Security and Medicare benefits that seniors have earned. The measure that I plan to introduce will have reasonable exceptions for things like times of war or severe economic downturn. I also support my fellow Representative Jim Cooper's no budget, no pay legislation. Everyone in this country understands that if you don't do your job on time, you won't get paid. The same rules should apply to Congress. If we don't pass a budget and the funding bills by October 1st, Congress shouldn't get paid. I also support taking a hard look at the return we've received from government programs to determine if we're getting good outcomes or just perpetuating spending with little or no results. We can do this by building a results-driven policy agenda and ensuring that scarce federal resources are invested in what works. They're invested more wisely using tax dollars and improving outcomes for young people, for their families, and for their communities. During my time as mayor, we launched several evidence-based programs to track and measure what outcomes the public received in return for spending their precious tax dollars. We evaluated programs and we improved and we reallocated dollars as appropriate. Now, national headlines say that no one in either political party is talking about the debt. We must have that conversation, and we must work until we find solutions to the harm that's caused by the debt. It's clear that our country is on a dangerous and unsustainable course, and it is past time for both parties to stop digging. The decisions, they won't be easy, but our children and our grandchildren are counting on us to make this right. Thank you for allowing me to testify.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The ranking member is recognized.
All right, Mayor. You've got a $4.5 trillion budget. You've got $3.5 trillion worth of revenue. So you've got a $1 trillion delta in here. So if your balanced budget amendment, and look, I agree that the only way to really ever force the hand of Congress is to enshrine it into the Constitution, because that's what we pledge to uphold when we take our oath of office. Where would you begin and how would you do it? Because I think we get universal support. The heads nod yes when we talk about a spending problem or spending more. You know, Arkansans, just like Utahns, agree that we ought to be able to balance our books like our states do. But we have some incredibly difficult choices to make. So how do you do that?
Well, thank you, Ranking Member. And this is, you know, coming back to my experience as mayor, and granted it's a different, we had a $1.3 billion budget, which is different than a $4 trillion budget, to be sure. But there's no program that doesn't have a constituency and people who support that program. But I think that's why I support a balanced budget amendment, because I think you've got to start with the premise of a requirement to balance a budget. And there are tough choices. It's not a simple matter of funding the good programs and not funding the bad ones. But we have to make qualitative assessments of what each dollar is doing and what return on investment each dollar is giving to the taxpayer. So my proposal would be to start with a balanced budget requirement. Probably with the state we're in right now, it's not gonna, we'd have to phase it in over a period of time. But if you set that expectation first and foremost, then we have to do the qualitative evaluation on every dollar that's spent, and we're gonna have to make some really hard choices to get there. What I found working as mayor, they're tough decisions, and they can become partisan, but we know at the end of the day, we have to balance that budget. And so there's a give and a take, and we may see programs that we like, but the return, the human return or the fiscal return on that investment may be X, and another investment is 2X. And so we have to make tough choices like that. We also look at where we can have public-private partnerships or other partnerships that might help us to stretch those dollars further to maximize the bang for the buck. So,
as a former mayor, with my time expired now, as a former mayor, I look forward to working with you under kind of that mayor's mentality to try to get to the right answer.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank the ranking member and the witness. Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you very much once again. And now recognize Mr. Klein for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've enjoyed Congressman McAdams' remarks. My predecessor, Congressman Goodlatte, was the sponsor of the balanced budget amendment many years, and I hope to work with him on that. And I think that would go a long way toward addressing many of the issues that we're facing. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our continued failure to control federal spending and address our mounting debt truly is the greatest threat to this nation. When I ran for office last fall, I promised the citizens of Virginia's 6th Congressional District that I would reintroduce 4 words to Washington: we can't afford it. These are 4 words that should have been repeated endlessly over the last 22 years since the last time a federal budget with a surplus was signed into law in 1997. In Virginia, where I served in the House of Delegates for 16 years, we were required to balance our budget every year. And because we placed a priority on fiscal responsibility, Virginia is frequently listed among the best states in which to do business. And all too often, throughout my tenure in the House of Delegates, we were required to tell people we can't afford it. In contrast, the federal government has an outstanding public debt of more than $22 trillion. Every year since 1997, Congress has failed to maintain a fiscally responsible budget and instead has relied too much on raising the debt ceiling. Because of this practice, back in 2011, the credit rating of the U.S. was reduced from AAA to AA+ and has remained at that level since. Virginia has maintained its AAA bond rating, making it one of only a few states to have that honor. Not only is the current practice of not passing a balanced budget fiscally irresponsible, poses a threat to our national security. And I see Congressman Biggs here, who led the effort to highlight that fact, and President Trump has also highlighted the need to reduce the national debt through fiscal responsibility. In September 2011, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mullen warned that the biggest threat to our national security is debt, and since that statement, our national debt has increased by almost 50%. As members of Congress, we must understand that the national debt is indeed a threat to our national security, that deficits are unsustainable, irresponsible, and dangerous. Committing Congress to restoring regular order in the appropriations process and addressing the fiscal crisis faced by the United States is no longer just an option, it's a necessity in the future of our great republic, and future generations depend on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Anyone have a question for the witness? No? Now recognize Ms. Houlihan from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen, and I'd like to kind of work off of Representative Klein and Representative McAdams talking to us about the responsibility we have as members of Congress to be responsible to the people that we serve. And I am a first-term representative from Pennsylvania, and I, among several, a lot of people in the 80s, nearly a quarter of the Congress came to Washington to rebuild trust in our government, to rebuild the democratic process, and to fix what largely people perceive on the outside of this bubble to be a very broken Congress. And unfortunately, when I and my classmates entered office, we were already in the midst of what would then become the largest and longest government shutdown in our country's history. And this, frankly, was unacceptable to me and to many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and most importantly, to the American people that we were brought here to serve. I watched as constituents at home went without pay, and people were used as pawns in political negotiations. And now that the government is open again, we seem to be quickly forgetting the pain that we inflicted on the people of our communities. And so I come here in full appreciation of the work that the Budget Committee does to come to bipartisan budget resolutions that allow the appropriation process to move forward in a timely manner. But I also am coming here to hopefully re-elevate the importance of something called the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns bill. Each year, we must work together to draft an appropriations package to fund our government. Debate is to be expected, but what we should never tolerate is federal workers and contractors being forced to work without pay because we in the executive and legislative branches have failed to perform our very basic duties as elected officials. And this is why I first introduced H.R. 834, the Shutdown to End All Shutdowns Act, which was co-sponsored by close to 24 of my freshman classmates. This bill was designed to disincentivize shutdown as a negotiating tool by transferring the financial hardship of the shutdown to the very people who caused it, the executive branch and the members of Congress, rather than the people that we serve. We really need to move on from the politics of partisan gridlock. We really need to move on from continuing resolutions and government shutdowns, and we absolutely have to come together to pass a spending bill every year that serves our constituents and upholds our values. We need to return to regular budget order and not budget by crisis. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will definitely take any questions you have with the remainder of my time.
Great. Thank you for your testimony. Anything? Thank you very
gentlemen.
much. I now recognize Mr. Biggs of Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Womack. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this committee today. A few weeks ago, our national debt surpassed $22 trillion. That's not news to you, but it is roughly equivalent of $68,000 per person in the United States. And since 2017, the national debt has grown by over $2 trillion. Democrats and Republicans are both at fault in the current fiscal state of our country. All of us are concerned. Both sides of the aisle are concerned as well. And we've talked about regular order. Both parties need to look at reforming Social Security and Medicare to ensure these programs remain sustainable. Social Security and Medicare make up the majority of our federal budget, and CBO has forecast that Medicare will run out of money in 2026 and Social Security in 2034. And many of my colleagues and I have promised to cut spending and enact substantial budget reforms, but have been unable to keep our commitments because it's been tough to have a true regular order process in this Congress. In fact, our inefficiency has seen and caused the United States credit rating from Standard & Poor's to fall from AAA to AA+. And without a targeted effort to balance our budget, our credit rating will surely continue to fall. President Trump's national security strategy highlights the need to reduce the national debt through fiscal responsibility, and President Trump's not alone. in recognizing the national debt as a threat to national security. A bipartisan group of national security leaders like former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Michael Mullen, Secretaries of Defense James Mattis and Leon Panetta, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates, and others have warned that our continued increase in our national debt will eventually hinder our ability to sustain our national security. To address this issue, I introduced a resolution recognizing the national debt as a threat to America's national security, and I am happy to report that many of our own colleagues, some who serve on this committee, in fact more than 50, have signed on to this resolution. But it'll take more than just promises and sound bites. We have a lot of work to do. I wanted to report on something that happened for me. The lights went out as I testified. This happens to me.
We apologize.
Yeah, it's all right.
It was not an editorial comment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I served on the Arizona Appropriations Committee for 14 years. The last 6 years, I served in the Arizona legislature. I effectively wrote the state budget with my colleagues. When I took over that duty, we had lost 34% of our state revenue in a 9-month period. We were considered to be the per capita hardest hit at the end of the 2008, at the beginning of the 2008 recession. We managed to restore the glide path by creating a glide path so we could meet our obligations, provide the services that we felt were the most necessary. And the result is that I report to you today that Arizona has a $1 billion structural surplus, which is contrary to the multi-billion-dollar negative situation we were in just a few short years ago. I am convinced we can do this. It will take bipartisan sacrifice, bipartisan cooperation, and part of the way we do this is to continue to talk about this, elevate it, make it a real priority. Quite frankly, I feel like sometimes we spend so much time on so many other things that we fail to recognize how important what you do in this committee and what we do with our spending really is. I think it is the most important thing we do in Congress. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Questions? Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Cloud from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and Committee. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I thank you for having this time for us to come here and share our thoughts. I hail from the 27th Congressional District of the great state of Texas, and debt and deficit are two major concerns for residents in our district. I've come here today to address the cost of servicing our debt. As you know, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, among other services, provides estimates to Congress to show how a given piece of legislation will affect spending and revenues over the next 5 to 10 years. This resource has become an integral part of Congress, and it's been used to inform members and their staffs of the budgetary impacts of legislation. The CBO and GCT cost estimates, while useful, do not provide a complete view of the cost of legislation. Both the CBO and JCT scores, unfortunately, do not include the cost of servicing the debt. As Maya McGinnis of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget explains, if interest on the debt is not counted, the official scores of legislation can be deceptively low, especially when offsets would occur years in the future. American taxpayers and future generations deserve honest accounting, not more gimmicks that attempt to paper over our huge and unsustainable deficits. The folks back home understand this. If they were budgeting for monthly car payments and only considered the list price of the car itself and didn't factor in the cost of extra interest payments, they might discover later that the actual total cost was more than they could afford. In essence, Congress has been doing this same thing by not considering the comprehensive budgetary impacts of spending and taxing proposals. This distorts congressional decision-making in favor of more spending and debt accumulation that might otherwise be the case. Take, for example, a scenario that played out in 2009. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 was estimated to increase deficits by $787 billion, according to the CBO. However, then CBO Director Doug Elmendorf testified to then Representative Paul Ryan that due to interest payments, the costs would be higher over the budget window, pushing the cost of the bill to over $1 trillion. Let me conclude with this. While the CBO occasionally provides insights to interest payments through updates to Congress, legislators are not regularly given this information to consider. As a result, members of Congress have an incomplete view of the long-term impact of the votes that we're taking. Servicing the national debt is becoming a substantial part of federal spending. Within a few years, our national spending on interest will be more than the entire Department of Defense budget. By 2029, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that net interest payments will have climbed to $928 billion. This will increasingly crowd out other spending priorities. And this is bipartisan concern. In a recent article, Democrat Representatives Correa, Murphy, O'Halloran, and Brindisi wrote, "Our growing debt poses a threat to the U.S. economy and the quality of life of every American, not to mention our national security and our ability to respond to unexpected challenges." I've introduced a bill, H.R. 638, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act, which would, among other things, require the CBO and JCET to include debt servicing costs in their estimates. I would hope that the FY 2020 budget resolution would adopt this bill or similar policies so that the American public has a clearer view of how much congressional spending costs. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Ranking member?
Thank you. To Andy, Mike, and to Jody, who will speak here in a minute, thank you, guys, for coming in here. We had 26 members out of 435, a little less than 435, got a couple of vacancies, but we have 26 members representing far less than 10%, maybe 5% of our caucus, or our whole Congress that's in here testifying on matters of budget. But everyone would say that when they go home, people are talking about deficits and debt, which is kind of the purview of this committee. So Mike, because you were testifying, let me just throw this question out. Let's say we have $1 trillion deficit this year, and we're going to try to address that $1 trillion deficit. Let's say we were going to try to take it to zero. About 70% of federal spending is on the mandatory side, and we know what those programs are, and about 30% is on the discretionary side, give or take a percentage or two. So is it as simple as saying we're going to look at reforms that would give us savings on a 70-30 kind of basis, mandatory versus discretionary? How would you do that?
Are you asking me to rewrite the federal budget?
Not in 58 seconds.
Yes, I've been here for 8 months, still working on how to fix everything. I do know that Congress is broken. I think this proposal that I'm proposing is one step to us being able to have the information to make those kind of decisions.
Is your early understanding of the budget process reform at least flawed in your position, or in your opinion, if not broken?
I'm sorry?
Is the current budget process, budgets and appropriations that we do today based on the 74 budget construct, is it flawed?
What I know is that every year we spend more money than we take in. Americans, the people who elected me and us, recognize that this is unsustainable. It's a huge national security threat, and we've got to find a way to get back to sensible budgeting.
I know when I go back to my district and my town hall meetings and people talk about deficits and debt, we are in general agreement that we have a problem. The real challenge for us is when we start discussing what the solutions are. And then you start stepping on toes and people start defending their programs.
Ultimately, it's going to have to come down to us caring more about the country than we do being here.
I agree. I go back.
Thank the gentleman. And now, maybe last but not least, distinguished former member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Arrington from Texas.
You never said distinguished when I was here, Mr. Chairman, but I...
Now, can I add also a distinguished member of the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform?
Thank you, Ranking Member, and honored to have served on the committee with you. Very proud of the work we did. You're a gentleman, Mr. Chairman, and I just appreciate the way you do business. Mr. Former Chairman, but my chairman during my tenure here, very proud of the product that we put out. A balanced budget over 10 years, reduction in spending, which I think is completely out of control, and the problem, 70% of which is on the mandatory side, which has been discussed. And that's 90% of the growth over the next 10 years, and we reduced it under your leadership to a greater extent than has been done in 20 years. Thank you. Proud to have been a part of that. It's mind-boggling for the American people to do the math on 22 trillion and in 10 years, 33 trillion. In the next 10 years, we'll go from a close to $1 trillion deficit spending, annual spending, to over 10 trillion, 100% in 10 years of our entire value of the United States economy, and so on and so forth. And it's just, it's scary, and it's will have a disastrous effect on our children and grandchildren. Now, that's what I loved about the Budget Committee. That's why I'm here, because I think the greatest threat to the future of this country is this debt path and the prospects of a sovereign debt crisis. And nobody knows when it's going to happen, but when the dominoes start to fall, you won't be able to get it back. We won't be able to get it back, and we will send this economy so far backwards that our kids will be in a very, very abysmal economic condition, and they will not be able to pursue their dreams and have their families and pursue their careers like we have in this great country. With that backdrop, I'm here to talk about the Medicare for All proposal. I don't know how, with 22 trillion and all the things I just talked about, we can introduce another big government takeover, essentially, of the healthcare economy. Now, there's no price tag on what the Democrats have introduced in the way of this Medicare for All proposal, but most conservative estimates have it at upwards of $30 trillion. Now, to keep up with that, not to mention the trajectory we were on under current policies and associated spending, which I just described, drop the weight of $30 trillion on top of that, I don't know how you can sustain it. I don't know how you prevent the triggering of that sovereign debt crisis. The American people are not going to tolerate doubling their taxes. We just gave them relief, and 8 out of 10 Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 60% have $1,000 or less in their checking account, and this would be a disaster. So the problems are cost, but they're also quality of care, in my opinion. Now, it wasn't too long ago that we had the introduction of the Affordable Care Act. And that was ironically titled because we've seen nothing but cost skyrocketing. We had premiums go from $2,800 to $6,000 across the country. We had the reduction of choice, essentially one provider per county in over half the counties in the country. It did not work out well. And now we want to double down on that and move to a universal care, single-payer system like the VHA, and that hadn't worked out for veterans. I served on the VA committee, and I got to tell you, what a disservice to our veterans. I mean, they're trapped. Some of them got sicker. Some of them died waiting in line for care. That was the universal health system that I was familiar with in the context of that committee. Included in this proposal is the Democrats' proposal and idea on how to fix this ever-increasing cost of drugs. We all know that's a problem. But the solution, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, is not price controls. It's not compulsory licensing where the government literally comes in and takes somebody's intellectual property because they don't like the way they price it, and then they distribute it the way they want to because government knows best. I can't even fathom of a situation like that, but that's what's included, and it will destroy any notion of consumers choosing the very best drug therapies for the best quality of life and life-saving drugs. I know my time is limited here, but that, to me, the answers are, for me, real simple, and I don't mean to be too dogmatic about it, but we need people competing for our business as consumers, as patients. We need healthy markets, robust markets. We need transparent markets where consumers can be informed and empowered and make rational decisions. And if we do that, I think everybody will win, and we'll get quality care at an affordable price for the whole healthcare market, not just on the provision of care between doctors and patients, but drugs and every other component. Thanks for for allowing me to testify. I know I went over my time, but some things don't change, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, ranking members.
No question. I just wanted, again, thank Jody for serving on the Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform. It was an extremely important effort that we, even though we did not get through the tape, we got very close.
Yes, we did.
But there's three guys sitting right here.
That's right.
The chairman and the two of us that were in the yes column on at least taking, if not a baby step, a little more important step
Yes.
forward in trying to fix our broken process.
Thank you, very meaningful, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your
Absolutely.
leadership.
Thank you. Just one comment about prescription drugs, because you said with all due respect, I have no proposal, so I didn't take offense. But there are a number of initiatives being discussed now in various committees on how to deal with prescription drug prices, and I hope we can come to a bipartisan agreement on something that'll work and solve the problem.
I do too, Mr. Chairman. As a new member of Ways and Means, I do hold out great hope that we can have a bipartisan solution there. I just don't want, I think there's some ground in the middle there to work on.
Great. I thank you, and I want to thank all the witnesses. Thanks for hanging around. And while we had 26 times as many witnesses, I think the hearing was worth a greater factor than 26 times.
I enjoyed the hearing.
It was very good. So I thank the ranking member and all the members, and because the testimony here will be important as we consider funding and policy priorities for the 2020 budget resolution. Unless anyone has any further business, without objection, this hearing is adjourned.